Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby Laws, and this is my co-host,
Christopher Wells.
We have a new NBA champ, and with NBA season officially over, the offseason does begin, but we won't be slowing down anytime soon in terms of our content and stuff like that. Expect a couple of streams coming up, including the draft stream, with special guest Miami Heat Network. We do have a comment on our short, about Klay Thompson from last week, and it's from the user at JD5Milk3. Love Klay, but bro really went 0 for 10 in an elimination game. He can can go get that bag, but I want to see him retire happily. I mean, I feel like that's how we feel, both of us together. Me personally, yeah. I think the guy, his career is pretty much over, at least in terms of playing, at that higher level that we're used to seeing him play. But go ahead and share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, like I think he will get paid by somebody, right? Whether it's Golden State or somewhere else. It's just going to be interesting where, how much money is it? How many years, right? He's looking for 3, right? Is his role going to change, right? Because like you said, he can't really be, one of your go-to guys anymore like he could be before. But he's probably now entered the stage of where he can still probably help out a team, but in a lesser role. He can't, if he's one of your, primary pieces, that's a problem. But, as we've seen with some of these other older players, like we saw, like Batum, Kyle Lowry, and others, there is a spot where if those guys can adjust their games, they can help out just in different ways than they, than they were able to before. So, we'll see. But regardless, like you said, we're hopefully he, gets paid and, whenever he retires, he feels really satisfied about what he was able to do, which I think he should be because he won 4 titles and was a big part of every single one of them.
Yeah, amazing career for sure. And, we will be discussing tons of rumors and action that already happened, in this episode. So, just a fair warning, it might be a longer one. But before we do get started with today's episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yeah, so the NBA season is, has ended.
Yeah.
And as you said, we have a new NBA champion. It's the Boston Celtics, right? The 6th different title winner in the last 6 years, right? They beat the Dallas Mavericks in 5 games, right? With Jaylen Brown winning Finals MVP, right? Averaging 21 points, 5 assists, 5.5 rebounds, right? And so, when you look at this Celtics team, right? Obviously they only lost 3 games in the postseason. And they were pretty much able to win by committee, right? Like everybody, that played, decent minutes for the team, right, contributed, at a high level in different ways, right? Obviously, you had the 2 main guys, Tatum and Brown, right? Those were your 2 drivers, right? Obviously, with Tatum, he gave you 22, 8, and 7 in the finals, right? Shot 39 from the field and 26 from 3, right? But still, I believe led the team, in points, rebounds, and assists. So obviously, even though the efficiency and shooting splits weren't great, still contributed to winning, heavily, right? Obviously, he played a big part in their ability to defend as well. Even though he wasn't the main guy guarding Luka, right? He's still the guy where, he's guarding the center. He can rebound, right? If you switch, right, with the big man, then he'll be switched onto the ball handler, right? And obviously, everybody on the Celtics, for the most part, can do that, right? Their offense, right, in the finals, they only shot 34 from 3 as a team. But you did have some guys, right? Derek White shot 39.5. Jrue Holiday shot 42, right? Sam Hauser shot 48 coming off the bench, right? Even Porzingis in his, limited minutes in the finals because of his injury, right? He contributed. Al Horford also was big as well, right? So everybody that played major minutes contributed. And I think, the cool thing about, the last several champions is, each one kind of has a different theme, right? Like say like for the Nuggets last year, right? That was their, big success, right? Because they had drafted those guys. They had been to the playoffs for a while, and then they were able to kind of, in the first trip to the finals, get it done. But for the Celtics, it's redemption, right? Because obviously they went to the finals a couple of years ago. They've made deep playoff runs as well, but in that finals, they didn't do as well. Last year, they had a chance, but they went down 0-3, tied it up, and then lost in Game 7. And then this year, they did what, both you and I at the end of that series, said they should do, right? They needed to kind of, upgrade the roster and make changes around the margins, right? We said they probably are going to have to say goodbye to guys like Marcus Smart and or Robert Williams. And what did they do? They ended up getting rid of Marcus Smart and Robert Williams, also Malcolm Brogdon, brought in Drew Holiday and Kristaps Porzingis, right? Even though we didn't have them, they were my preseason pick, but they weren't my, pick going into the postseason.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason why we were both very high on this team was because we liked the moves that they made, and we thought that, it helped them on both ends of the floor. Right? Because obviously, even though offense wasn't the big thing for them in the postseason, it was a big part of their whole season as a whole, right? They shot great from three pretty much the entire season. They were blowing out teams left and right. And it didn't change really anything for them on defense, right? Like, say, a guy like Porzingis can protect the rim like Robert Williams, right? But also can give you a lot of stuff on offense, right? If you put a smaller guy on him, he can take advantage because he can post up and still score, right? Drew Holiday, right, is a great fit in that backcourt, right? That's the best defensive backcourt in the NBA, right? And those guys are all NBA defenders. So, it's a really great team in terms of the talent put around them. As for the Mavs, right, obviously it's tough, to lose, in the NBA Finals. I think most people expected it to be a more competitive series, for the most part. But, if you're the Mavs, you also had a really good season as well, even though you didn't win the title, because going into the season, most people were not super high on this team, right? I think both you and I thought they would make the playoffs, but more so as a play-in team. We didn't really expect, we didn't really know what they were going to do at that point, right? Because we thought that there might be a version of the team where they kind of struggle and then maybe Kyrie's out of there, or something like that, right? And we liked what they did in the offseason, but we still didn't think they were good enough. But then they made the big moves at the deadline, where they got PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford. And it changed a lot of stuff, right? It made them better defensively, and they were still obviously a really good offensive team. And they had a really impressive run during the postseason. But they went up against a team that was just a lot better, right? Obviously, Luka, right? We know he's been kind of getting crushed, for his lack of defense, and ultimately a performance in the finals that I think some people feel like is probably worse than you would have liked to have seen. Obviously, we know Kyrie's been getting crushed as well. But I don't think we should just shortchange what the Mavs were able to do. But, regardless, if you're the Celtics, right, they did what they were supposed to do, right? They went into the season with the mindset of winning the title. They went in and they, pretty much breezed through it, right? There weren't really too many struggles. You only really had a handful of super tight competitive games, and it was the Pacers series, right? Most of the other series weren't really, that competitive. I know there were a couple of close competitive Cavs games, but you knew that the Celtics would pull it out, right? There was never a question, in our eyes, whether or not they would get out of the East, because I think we liked them both better than Milwaukee. It was just a matter of whether or not they could win the title, and they were, and they did, right? Obviously, we didn't expect the Mavs to make the finals. We expected the Nuggets to get there, and that's why I think we thought that the Nuggets, would beat the Celtics. But, if you're the Celtics, right, you were able to take advantage of the opportunities you were given, which happens every year. Right, I know there's a lot of people that talk about that they had a cakewalk path, which you can say that they did, but either way, it doesn't really matter because every team always has something that kind of goes their way, in order to win a title, right? Like say even the Nuggets last year, right? They didn't play, they didn't play one of the top seeds, right? They played an 8th seed. Obviously, the Heat you still give them credit to for making the finals. But, it's still different, right? And obviously you can even go further back, right? Like when the Warriors won the title in 2022, right? The Western Conference wasn't quite the same as it normally was, right? Because, there was no Nuggets, there was no Clippers or Lakers, or anybody like that, right? You had the Suns, who were really good. And then you had the Grizzlies, who were good, but they were young. And then you had the Mavs, right? Who, they were just happy to be there, right? And then you keep going back, right? The Bucks and the Suns both, had stretches where they, played against teams that were not 100%, right? The Lakers were in the bubble. The Raptors, right, had a ridiculous, scenario play out in the finals where Durant's out and Clay's out, right? Clay was out in game 6 or whatever. But, so that doesn't really change, the math in terms of we both think that even if the teams in the East were healthy, right, the Celtics still win, right? Maybe it's not a 4-5 game series, but it's still a scenario where it's not in doubt who wins. Even in the finals, I know Luka had the injection stuff or whatever, but I still think even if Luka was healthy, the Celtics still win because they're just better, right? And sometimes the better team wins, and that's literally what happened here. and they won in a very impressive fashion by, kind of continuing to build on what their identity was, right? Where we have these two very dynamic, versatile wings, and we have multiple guys who can all shoot from the 3-point line, play 5 out, drive and kick. And that's kind of a cool thing. So for the Celtics and the Mavs, they both went all in, and they were rewarded for going all in. And we got to see once again another guy, right, in Porzingis, where he's on another team, comes to this team, and then kind of molds his role into what they need, right? Like last year was Aaron Gordon. The year before was Andrew Wiggins. So, we got to see a lot of cool stuff, I think, over the course of the postseason. And you give a lot of credit to the Celtics because, again, there were a lot of people, right, that were questioning how good, was this team really, right? In terms of like, all the regular season stuff is nice, but can they actually get it done in the postseason? And they did it, right? So now, all those guys are champions. And, the cool thing is the fact that, I guess a little similar to the Nuggets is that their core guys, right, they drafted both Tatum and Brown, and they kept them. They never split them up, which they never were going to, in my mind, or should have anyways. I know there was a little kind of talk at one point about maybe we trade Jaylen Brown for Kevin Durant, and, they didn't. And now they're champions. And that's awesome, if you're a Celtics fan.
Yeah, and I think awesome is kind of the way to describe this title and what they've been able to accomplish. Like you said, I think they're more on the underrated side of things. I think they do have 5 all-star caliber guys, 3 bench players who can also shoot 45% from the 3. And just a little fun fact, that hasn't happened in a long time. That hasn't happened since KD was on the Warriors, just FYI.
Right.
And I think they're extremely slept on because they made every single series that they were in look like a cakewalk. And I think that's what good and great teams do. That's what all-time teams do. I know when we were in our live stream, you brought up the question, are the Celtics an all-time team? And I think I was the only person in there who said yes. Our guest, he said no. You said no. The majority of the chat said heck no. We had a lot of capital no's and, F no's. So, everybody was kind of just like, no. But I completely disagree. I think that's kind of what happens when you dominate every single team in the league, like this team did. And I think a lot of people were blind to it until we kind of got to the playoffs and they kind of started looking a little scary because, there's always conversation of the regular season is meaningless, but we could take a look at what they've been able to do. And, throughout the regular season, they hold the all-time point differential. They were top 2 on both ends of the floor as well. Most efficient offense in NBA history. And, going into the postseason, they shut down the Dallas offense. So I think those things combined with it is amazing. And another thing, they also improved in the clutch significantly over the past, 4 years. So, I think the internal growth and what we've seen, from really Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown together, I think that's the catalyst. Then you add, the missing pieces like you talked about, bringing in Drew Holiday, winner's move. Now he's, the missing piece for 2 franchises. I think that helps his legacy more than some other guys that we've seen on this team as a whole. Kristaps Porzingis being an X factor, in the finals at times. It's just unfortunate that he wasn't healthy. We only got to really see 1 round, I think, of him fully healthy, which, was kind of always a concern when you bring a guy like him in. But, I think if he was there, people's opinions would be, through the roof. And we were talking about that a little bit. Yeah, we were talking about that a little bit before we started. But, I think the hate on this team is astronomical. I think we all know why. It's because they're Boston. They're not necessarily everybody's favorite team. But, ignoring your personal bias, I just gave you guys all the facts. I'm not going to reiterate them or go, too in depth on them. But they handled everybody in the league, made them look like light work. And like I said, that's what great teams do. So you have to tip your hat to them. Dallas perspective, you'll be back. That's the way that I look at it. It's not over. Your team may look different when you're back, but you still got Luka. I think, he played a good series on offense. Like you said, picked apart defensively. And that's what he's going to need to change in his game because we haven't really seen a lot of players that are a little bit, I'm not going to say like Luka's one dimensional because he has so many dimensions on offense, but in terms of his game, he's missing that defense. And I think that's something that will for sure hurt him, especially with that roster that they do have constructed.
Right.
As good as they are on defense as a team, that gaping hole is very large, including Kyrie as well. Kyrie's defense wasn't as bad as Luka's, but
Mhm.
you could still see they were getting picked on. So
And I think that's where that comes from too, right? Like
yeah,
where it's like, even though they were a really good defensive team, they don't have anybody that you would look at and be like, this is an all NBA, one of the best defensive players
sure,
in the league, right? Because I feel like we've seen players in the past that aren't great defensively, but they're surrounded by guys that are significantly better defenders as well, right? Like, Harden was not a great defender, right? And then at one point, they had a really good defensive group. Now, to be fair, right? Like, would you say Clint Capella, Trevor Ariza, PJ Tucker are those all NBA level defenders?
no, probably not.
Right. Chris Paul. And then obviously, you look at the Warriors, right? And Steph is different because I think he tries much more on defense than say like a Luka. But
There's
I also don't
limitations
necessarily
though.
look at him as like an elite level defender.
Sure,
And I also think again, you got Draymond, you got when Clay was in his prime, he was an elite defender.
for sure.
Also like say the title year Wiggins, right? So it's
Oh
like
yeah, big time.
but that's what you should do in terms of putting together a roster around your best players. You need to kind of put together a roster that can kind of take advantage of certain things, and that's kind of the interesting thing with Boston, right? Where they were almost kind of stacking stuff on top of one another. Whereas say like with some other teams, a lot of times it'll be like, all right, what does this guy not do? Let's get guys that do the things that he doesn't do.
Sure.
Whereas like for Boston, everybody does it.
Yeah, and it's like I feel like their roster construction, I'm not going to say like it was traditional because I feel like it was a little unorthodox like you were talking about, but they kind of have set the tone, I think, for what championship teams are probably going to look like. And we kind of saw it, with Denver last year where, it's all about size, defense, complementary players. But then, you look at Boston, they kind of, I guess, added on to it and gave it their own little twist because, you have Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, who aren't, guards, they're wings, but, they're so good on both ends of the floor. And then you also double down and just like, add on to that with Drew Holiday, who's great on both ends of the floor, D White, great on both ends of the floor, and Porzingis, those are 5 all-star caliber players. I know some people have questions about D White. I think he's probably the most underrated player on that squad in terms of, where people rank him and whatever. But yeah, it's crazy. And like another thing, the narrative on this finals is hilarious. Going into it, we saw it. The whole internet saw it. Everybody was talking about Mavs in 5, Mavs in 5, Mavs in 6,
Right.
Mavs
We
in
got
7.
comments.
Yeah, we got 20 comments, a lot of comments talking about Mavs in 7, it's never over. First 3-0 comeback. We're not going to mock anybody, but at the same time, like it just never really made sense
Right.
for this roster. And that's the thing that really bugs me is like this is one of those finals where I think it's so lopsided in terms of what people are putting out there. And it's like, I don't know. It's so tough to put your personal bias aside. I get it. But you do have to acknowledge that this Celtics team is one of the good ones. They handled everybody with a swiftness. And like you talked about, people called it a cupcake walk, but at the end of the day, they faced the Mavs that were healthy. That's all that matters, really.
Right.
They faced a healthy Mavericks team.
Yeah.
Yes, Luka was laboring at times, but I mean, isn't everybody in the postseason at some point?
Right.
Nobody's really truly fully healthy in the postseason.
Porzingis wasn't healthy.
Exactly. You got Porzingis, saying he's gonna die out there, and it's like, all right, bro, like let's be realistic here. It doesn't matter who you probably put in front of the Boston Celtics. Maybe Minnesota beats them. Maybe Denver. I don't know. Maybe somebody who's better equipped on the defensive end and maybe doesn't have as many players that you can attack. But I don't know. I just don't want to go to the ifs and the what ifs and stuff like that. But
You can say that about any,
exactly.
About any team.
And it's just funny how the flip flop was crazy because it went from, Mavs in 5 and then now it's okay. Tatum needed a super team. Oh my God. It's just hilarious. So, I don't know where the NBA goes from here because they're not going to put respect on Tatum specifically. I think, people have given JB his flowers for sure.
I think
that's kind of what I've been seeing. JB, the Celtics, Missoula, Brad Stevens, everybody. I think everybody's getting their flowers and congrats except for Tatum. I don't know what your take is on that, though.
Right. Yeah. I think for most people, I feel like most people, and I think we were kind of talking about it on the live stream. I think where a lot of people kind of landed at is that the main guy that it probably changes a lot of people's mindset or views on is probably Brown, right? Because that was the guy that signed the $300 million, whatever richest contract in NBA history, and he was getting, clowned at the time, right? We all obviously at the time we said it was a lot of money, but I don't think we ever said like this is a mistake, right? I know like some people might be like, okay, if it doesn't work out, he's probably the guy that gets moved. Because I think, some of the other stuff now is with the CBA, the upcoming one on the horizon, right? People are going to wonder, how are these teams going to keep these, guys together, right? Because obviously we know the Celtics, they're going to have to pay everybody, in order to keep everybody. And it's going to be very expensive, and it's going to be a lot more difficult to add to the roster, right? But obviously they're pretty much set, right? Because they've already done all the hard work, right? Yeah. Their job is to basically just, maintain.
Yeah,
right?
And win.
Because yeah, but I think that's the big thing for Boston is I feel like for a lot of people, my guess is that the one, like I said, that I think most people have probably maybe flipped on is Brown. Whereas I feel like most of the other guys, like you said, outside of I guess Missoula, right? Probably, have kind of, they haven't really like moved up a ladder. I guess for a lot of people is, what my guess is on the general takeaway from most people, right? Because I think. And that was kind of the case it seemed like going into the series, right? Where I think we were saying like, for Boston, they have more to lose, or Dallas has way more to gain, right, than Boston. Because say if the Mavs had won, right, then it would be like, oh, is Luka the best player in the NBA, right? Is Luka and Kyrie the best duo? But then like with the Celtics, right, it was more so like, there wasn't as much, I guess, in a lot of people's minds that were going to change. I guess it would just, for me, it would more so cement, that they're a really, really good team. You know what I mean? Like, because that's all that they would have to do, in my mind, in order to do that is to just win the title, right? Yeah. So I think that's kind of more so the difference. But I guess that also just kind of speaks to, how people view the individual players for the Celtics, or at least the stars, more so than, a lot of other teams, right? Because say like for the Nuggets, right? Obviously, when they won the title, right, then it elevated everybody, right? Because it elevated Jokic, it elevated Murray, and Gordon, and pretty much, everybody, right, including the stars, right? Yeah. Obviously, when the Warriors won the title, it moved Steph up another tier, right? Because there were a lot of people that didn't even have him, as a top 10 guy, all time before that title, right? I guess Giannis, same thing, right? Because there were a lot of people who were like, who thought he was, there were a lot of people who thought he was the best player, or at worst, like top 2 or whatever, but they were like, oh, this guy's had some, series where his team has come up short, where they win a lot of regular season games, and then they don't win in the playoffs. But then they did, right? And obviously, like, they've had some rough first-round exits since. But, other than that, right, like, usually the title kind of, especially changes the legacies for the stars. But in this case, for Boston, it seems like it hasn't necessarily for Tatum, but it definitely has for Jaylen Brown. Like, I don't know if it necessarily would be like, oh, now is Jaylen Brown a top 10 player? I don't know if I don't think that's what people are saying, but I think, there were some people that might have been like, could Brown really be the second best player on the team? And the answer is obviously yes.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it elevates both of them, if you want me to be honest. I feel like it pushes Tatum top 5, and I think it pushes Brown up as well. Wherever you rank Brown, because I think it's tough to rank Brown. He's the hardest to rank, in my opinion.
He wasn't even all NBA.
That's my point. It's tough to rank him. But I think with Tatum, it for sure pushes him because I think it raises his value. If you want to look at stats, he may not be the most eye-popping guy. Cool. Right. There's probably there are a lot of guys who average a lot more than him, maybe are more efficient, maybe do a little bit more than him. But I think the title adds a lot of value and weight to the guy's name. It's not empty stats. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's a good point in terms of value because I think there probably would be, a lot of people, where it would probably be like, say like even me, where it's like, who's the better player between Embiid or Tatum? Like you might say Embiid, but which one would you rather have on your team?
I'm taking
probably
Tatum.
At this point, Jason Tatum, because, he may not necessarily be quote unquote as good, but he is more available. And he's also an incredibly versatile player who's very good, at the things that he does. So I think, I think that's probably where, if somebody didn't think so, that's where I think, like you said, the value part is the good point to make, right? Where like, some people I know will come up with like, ranking people's value in terms of like trade values, right? Like say for like the Celtics, right? Like they were never going to trade Jason Tatum anyways, right? Obviously.
Yeah.
But now like in terms of like, if he, like, would he be like a top, 5 trade asset, yeah. Like even if somebody doesn't view him as a top 5 player, he's a top 5 asset.
Yes.
So I think that's probably where, so I think that if people want to look at what changes for Jason Tatum, that would, I think, be the biggest thing, is I think his value has gone up significantly compared to, whatever it was before.
Yeah.
Right?
Agreed.
Like, and we were never people that were low on Jason Tatum anyways, because we had people in our live streams that thought that he was just like a
glorified
that he
role
was,
player.
Yeah, that he was trash, that he was like a fraudulent star. Like you said, a glorified role player, and it's like, no, he's really good. Like, he's very good.
Yeah, he does, I think, a lot more than people realize, I think the problem is people get caught up in his box score. His box score may not be the prettiest, it may not be the most consistent, but if you really sit down and watch the game and what he's able to do, especially really this season, that's what I really want to kind of like stay focused on this season and the postseason. If his shot wasn't falling, he was out there crashing the boards,
didn't matter.
moving the ball. Exactly. It didn't matter. And somebody was always there to pick up the slack. And that's what I really like about the Celtics team. They don't seem to be too wrapped up in the individual accolades. And we kind of saw that, early in the playoffs. I think it was Draymond who was talking to Tatum. He was like, what do you feel, or how do you feel about not being in that conversation of MVP? And he kind of just brushed it off, as he should.
Right.
And Jaylen Brown not being all NBA, these guys don't necessarily seem to care about it a whole bunch, but I think they, use it as a chip on their shoulder to kind of prove like, yeah, we're underrated just because of the team that we're on. Because I do understand other people's arguments when it's like, all right, if Joel Embiid is not top 5, then put him on that Celtics team. Do they win the chip?
You got to be available.
Exactly.
You got to be available.
Because if he's not available, then he doesn't play. Say it's okay. No, I don't know how to like
yeah, because it's tough because you're also like factoring in like, well, the team is built around Tatum,
right?
So it's like you can't necessarily just like swap them. But I think the bigger thing is that like maybe if like let's say you replace Tatum with like Luka, right? Like, are the Celtics still like a title team? Like, yeah, probably.
I think so.
But like at the same time, like for Boston, it's like you wouldn't say like, okay, did Tatum contribute to the wins? Like, yes, he did. Right? Like, is this Celtics team better with him on it? Yes.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's kind of an obvious one. Like, like, again, like you said, even though he didn't shoot well, he still did plenty of other things. You wouldn't say that, like, oh, they won the finals in spite of him.
Yeah,
like, no, he was a big part of their wins.
Team in scoring. Like, it's just funny how people are trying to, not necessarily, I don't want to say tear him down, but kind of discredit his role in the championship.
Right.
But like,
not poorly. So what? He still helped the team win.
Exactly.
Like,
and then like,
it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. And if you look at it from Dallas's perspective, I think there's a way that you can look at it and be like, Luka's value gets raised, but I know some people are a little bit lower on him based on the defense. I think some people, but I think he goes up a notch. I think arguably best. I don't know. That might be a hot take, but
yeah, I think if they had won the title, which, like, I know a lot of people would say, like, do you have to win the title to earn the best player chip? I feel like if he had won the title, I feel like a lot more people would probably say,
I think,
like, that he's the best. I think he would have had to have done that. I feel like he's probably not going to earn the best player moniker, right? Until they win the title. But I will say this, right? Like, because I think, like, with Jokic, right? Because, like, there were a lot of people that were dubbing him the best player before he won a title. But that was also because, he won the 2 MVPs, right? And his teams were usually winning, like, like 50 games or whatever every season. So I think, like, in terms of being the best player, I think the body of work also factors in as well. So I think with Luka, right, if he continues to have, like, his team somewhere around 50 wins, top 4 in the Western Conference each year, and putting up those type of stats, then he's going to get an MVP, and then he'll probably get, there'll be more people that will be willing to say he's the best player. And obviously, like with Dallas, they have time, right? Like, it's not like, this year was like the last year of this core group, right? Like, they have time to be able to, retool and upgrade. And I guess we can get into that stuff, if you want.
Yeah.
In terms of like what these teams, will be doing in the offseason. Like for the Celtics, it's pretty obvious, right? Like, they're going to just have to re-sign and extend, all their guys, right? Like, they already extended Brown and Porzingis. and I believe they extended Holiday like right before the playoffs, right?
Yep.
So now you just need to extend Tatum. I think it's like what 4 or 5 years, 313 or whatever. Obviously,
Yeah.
that's a no brainer.
I think that's like going to be the most or the biggest NBA contract in history, I
Yeah,
believe.
right. And like that's a no brainer,
Yep.
right? Because he helped you win a title, and he's their best player. So
Yep.
like obviously you do that. Bless you. I'm pretty sure they
Thank-
mentioned right they're gonna have to extend Derek White, right? I'm pretty sure that's like what 4 years and what was it like one what how much was it? It was
I
like one.
I think it was one something.
Yeah, it was like it was up there. So you have to do that, and I think they also mentioned extending Sam Hauser as well, right? Which is fine because right, again, when you look at the grouping of this roster, you don't really have a lot of room to bring in like you can't sign a guy in free agency that makes like 10-12 million dollars.
Yeah,
So
it
you
was
kind of need.
127 million, by the way, for D White.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. So, again, another no-brainer, right? So obviously you're going to do that. I don't think they ever mentioned the number for Sam Hauser, right?
Mm-mm.
So,
No.
yeah, exactly. So Derek White, you said 4 years, 127.
Yep.
Okay, so that's like 30 million a year,
Yep.
right? A little over 30. So, it's going to get really expensive, but we already saw them win the title. So it's like you have to pay the money to keep these guys together, and you're not going to really be in a position to add talent through free agency. But you already have a lot of talent, so you just have to keep that talent, re-sign those guys. It'll be interesting to see in the future what happens with Horford, right? Because obviously he's going to stay and play another year, but he could retire after next season. And obviously, if he retires, you're going to have to try to find another, big man somewhere, right? And we know that there's more of a premium now on bigs than there was like maybe a few seasons ago. So that'll be interesting. But there's not like a whole lot you have to say in terms of what they need to do. Just basically run it back, right? Maybe a couple minimum contract guys join that are like, I want to win a title with the Celtics, and I don't mind playing for the minimum contract, which I think, because they won the title, now they're, proven, I think, to a lot of people, right? So there's probably going to be somebody that won't mind joining them. But, for them, it's pretty obvious, right? For the Mavs, obviously, it gets significantly more intriguing because we know that they had a really good run, but the road for them to get back to the finals is a lot harder than Boston because they're not as good, and they're also in a conference that has more really good teams. So, because we know all the other teams in the West, right, that, went to the second round or better will be back, right? Like we know OKC, we know Denver, we know Minnesota, those will all still be good teams. And there will be teams below them, right, that will still be good. And there'll be teams that were not even in the playoffs that will be, better than they were this season. So that's the tough part for Dallas. Obviously, I think it would be nice to have another stretch big. That was Maxi Kleba. But, maybe you just say he had a bad injury, so maybe he'll be better next season. Because he was banged up pretty much most of the season.
Yeah.
Because he missed a lot. Yeah, because he missed time earlier in the season with something else. And then, obviously, he missed most of the postseason with a shoulder injury. And I think Luka likes him, so maybe that's another reason why he's on the roster. Obviously, right, Kyrie, right, he had a rough series, but I think you still would say, like, he was a big positive for the Mavs on the season. Right,
Yeah.
so obviously he's not going anywhere. Obviously, none of the guys that they just grabbed at the deadline are probably going anywhere. Derek Jones Jr. He was what a free agent. He'll be a free agent, 1 year minimum contract. It sounds like some people think that they might move Hardaway to create the space to give him closer to a contract that he has earned, which makes sense, right? Because Hardaway probably at the point where you probably are bringing him out, sending him out of there. And just either, elevating Hardy or just like, getting a different look in free agency. But I think it would be nice to probably add like another two-way guy. Obviously, those guys can be kind of expensive, but they're not, in that second apron. So they have more flexibility than some of these other, contending teams. So they might be able to add somebody. It'll be interesting, right? Because, obviously there are questions, and we had some in the live stream about like, what guy would want to play with those two guys. But somebody will, right? It's just a matter of will they be able to, pay them. And then obviously after that, right, I think you hope for some improvement from your young guys, right? Derek Lively was a rookie, right? So you would hope and assume that he gets better, in different ways, right? Maybe he adds more range to his shot. Maybe he just gets more comfortable out there playing, right? And, by getting all those minutes and all those opportunities, right, he becomes even more impactful. Maybe he starts.
Right.
Other guys, right, like Josh Green, Jaden Hardy, do any of those guys get better? Maxence Prosper, right, who was somebody that I think a lot of people were high on when they drafted him. What does he do? So, we'll see where they go from here. But I guess the Mavs definitely have way more questions than the Celtics. And it's not because they're not good. It's just a matter of, is what they did sustainable, right? Can they get back to the finals again next year? And that might be difficult, not because they're not good, but because they're in a really tough conference. And they're going to have to, they're going to have some things go their way, which is kind of like a secret thing, right? That not as many people say, right? Because obviously people mention Boston. Dallas had some things go their way, right? Because obviously the Clippers, right? Kawhi didn't really play except for a couple of games, right? OKC had no playoff experience, right? And then, obviously they still showed out against those teams. And it doesn't feel the same as the Celtics, in a lot of people's eyes. But I think that's the tough part for the Mavs is, what can you realistically do to improve this roster? And, even if you do improve, can you get back to the finals again? I don't know, right? We had somebody, in the stream say that they think the Mavs have peaked. I think they could win a title, but I don't necessarily know if they can do it, against that Celtics team. I think that's the tough part. But, again, we have already seen, right, that nobody's won back-to-back. So maybe there's a world where maybe the Celtics don't make it out of the East or some other bad injury luck happens and then maybe the Mavs break through. But either way, they have some things they have to pull off in the offseason.
Yeah, I think they have a lot of work to do. You already talked about the Celtics a lot. Like you said, just run it back. But with, the Mavericks, I think, they have a decent amount of targets that I think they should be looking at, the mid-level ones, the mid-level exceptions, all that stuff, minimum contracts even. I think there's a lot that they can do here. You look around, maybe like a Malik Beasley, Bruce Brown, I don't know. Gary Harris, right. Tobias Harris. I think, there are options for them. It's just a matter of, I think they need to take care of their guys first. So I'm curious, what those are going to look like. Like you talked about Jaden Hardy. I think he should come back. I think Exum should even come back. I think Derek Jones Jr. should come back. And, I think, you need to prioritize getting a two-way wing, perimeter shooting, off the dribble creation. I know it's kind of like a whole to-do list, right. But, yeah. And another thing I would say, which could potentially change the way this team really does look at the end of the offseason is, maybe target and look for some 5-out lineups because we're kind of seeing the NBA shift to a 5-out meta, which is, exactly how the Celtics won the title. And, you look at their team, everybody could space the floor, everybody could stretch it. And they can also take people off the dribble, which is pretty cool. So I think those are kind of the things they should be doing. You look at the mid-level exception guys. I think, a guy like Alec Burks, that could be an option. Luke Kennard, Royce O'Neal. I think they should just lock in on the wings, figure that out, and then maybe like a backup point guard, maybe in the minimum contract, like Campaign. Right. I don't know, DeLon Wright, somebody else. I think that can potentially help your team. But another thing would be, can they swing an impactful trade? I don't know about that. I think they do have some assets they could use, but it all depends on what you kind of rank as impactful. Right. So I don't know.
You don't really have any more picks.
Exactly. So that's kind of the tough part. But, I think there is a window for them to potentially kind of squeeze in there and maybe finesse a team. But I don't know.
Right. Yeah, and I think, like you said, all those make, a lot of sense, right? Because, like you said, the thing with 5-out, right? That's why I was kind of saying, like, yeah, you might need to find some other option as a stretch big. If it's not Maxi Kleber, if it is Maxi Kleber, it doesn't necessarily matter. You just need more versatile lineups because they had some, but not enough, against the Celtics, right? And again, maybe that's just a tough matchup, because obviously, like, defensively, right? Like, your backcourt, your perimeter defense kind of has a ceiling, right? With Luka and Kyrie as your guards. But like you said, that's why it would probably be a good idea to, like, if you get a backup point guard, it may not have to be like, a traditional backup point guard because you have Luka and Kyrie. It could be, like you said, like a DeLon Wright, who's more like a two-way specialist point guard that could play either next to Luka or Kyrie or even both. So that's something that would be really nice. Yeah. I think, like you said, and obviously the wings makes a lot of sense, right? Because I think having another wing that isn't Derek Jones Jr., and it's not because he's bad, it's just, again, you'd like to have, some other options as well, right? Like, you want more versatility, you want more options. So I think, those are good names. The Bruce Brown one is difficult, because I think it sounds like the Raptors are going to, accept his team option or exercise his team option. So that means he's going to, be on that $20 million a year contract. So you'd have to find some way to combine a couple salaries together, which they could. It's just I don't know. I don't know if there's another team that might be able to beat that, but I also don't know what the demand level for Bruce Brown is in terms of assets, right? Like, are
Right.
teams willing to give up picks, or is it more so just like matching salaries? I don't know, right?
Yeah.
And that's something that we'll have to see when it happens. But yeah, like you said, and like I said, the Mavs have way more work to do than the Celtics. For the Celtics, it's literally just paying everybody and running it back. For the Mavs, there's some personnel that you're probably going to have to change up.
Yeah. What a finals though. I'm
Yeah.
actually, I know a lot of people have been like, yeah, horrible finals, most forgettable, all this stuff, but it's like I enjoyed every moment of it, honestly.
Right, and that's something that I'm kind of, just kind of to run by you, just because
Yeah,
it's
what's
an
up?
interesting thing where, they were kind of, they had the numbers out, for the finals, right? And
Hmm.
it mentioned that it was, it's the least watched since '07,
Hmm.
only topping the COVID one, right? That was the bubble one with the Lakers and the Heat. And obviously that one, like, there's an excuse where it's like it's COVID, and it's like the worst time of COVID where it's like people were also out of work, so they couldn't necessarily stay at home and just watch TV, right? Some
Right.
people like just couldn't do anything. Um and that's interesting. Like, because obviously, this postseason as a whole, right? The last few postseasons, right? People have kind of had these debates about parity versus the super teams.
Hmm.
And I think it seems like in the earlier rounds, right? Like at least last year was better. But this year it seemed like a lot of it was down. Now for TV, there's a little bit of, some, I don't know, difficult stuff to kind of parse because obviously you have streaming involved, which changes some things. But, also if you look at some of the other sports, they did better, where you had back-to-back Super Bowls, right, that had record high views, right? Obviously they've mentioned, like the women's basketball games have been, have had record numbers. So it is kind of an interesting thing. Maybe that might be due to, the names, right? In terms of like maybe the league hasn't necessarily marketed the newer stars as well, right? Obviously, because you would think like, people have known who Jason Tatum is for a while. Like obviously he doesn't have the same, cachet as some of the other longer time stars, but it's not like he's just a random guy that nobody's ever heard of, right? Even same with Luka, right? Like Luka hadn't even been in a finals, but pretty much everybody knows who that is. But it is kind of an interesting discussion, right? Because I know the last few years, right, we saw the NBA kind of touting the ratings, for a lot of their games, but not so much this postseason. But it also doesn't matter a whole lot because they have the TV deal coming in. The only thing I guess that sucks about the media deal is that the games are going to be spread out on more platforms. So that might make it tougher to access for some people. But, what do you think about that? Right? Because I
Yeah.
feel like, because there have definitely been some finals that have been, like worse to watch.
Hmm.
Like I think the 2007 one was pretty rough, but also like there were reasons why, right? Because obviously, like with that was the Spurs Cavs one, right, where it was like LeBron's first NBA Finals. He's a younger guy, so he didn't have as great of a series, anyways. But also the team wasn't as great to watch. I mean, it was a different time, anyways, right?
Sure.
Last year's finals, right? Like obviously was also a 5-game series and wasn't really one where the series was ever in doubt at all, right? From the moment that finals started, right? Like you knew that like the Nuggets were winning. Although this year, right, I guess more people were split, but in our eyes, we both, kind of knew who was going to win these. But, what do you think? Because obviously, like, there have been finals that have been better. But I think it's also kind of goes back to, like, what you said about the Celtics, where it's like, even if you're not a Celtic fan, you still have to appreciate the way they play, right? Like,
Yeah.
in terms of, like, what they do as a team on both ends of the floor. And that's what, even if you're not a Celtics fan, that's what you should be watching and looking at, right? Because, again, there are some other teams that are trying to get to that point, and I think you could learn a lot from watching how they play, in terms of not just the talent but just the communication and attention to detail on both ends of the floor, right? Like you said, everybody's improved from where they were a year ago, and everybody plays for each other, right? Because like you said, Jason Tatum, he could care less about shooting poorly because he's doing a bunch of other stuff, and it led to a win, right? They don't win that finals without what he does on both ends of the floor. So that's how I feel about it too, right? Like I enjoyed watching the series, even if it wasn't as competitive as you would have liked. But you could also, appreciate, like you said, the fact that the Celtics, were that dominant, against the Mavs, where it just, it wasn't close. There were, obviously the Mavs had a chance in a couple of those games, but, a lot had to go right just for them to kind of be in that position.
I mean, yeah, there's a lot to unpack here.
Hmm.
Especially, with the ratings thing and the viewership numbers or whatever. A lot of people are drifting away from cable. That's number one.
Yeah.
A lot of people are also illegally streaming a lot of sporting events, and specifically the NBA, just because of the,
It's a lot harder to access.
exactly. Yeah, there's so many packages and there's so many ways to, watch the league, that you have so many different avenues of kind of weaseling your way around it versus the Super Bowl where kind of like the whole world is watching, same with the World Cup. So it's a little bit
Watch it
of
on
different.
Nick.
Exactly. It's a little bit different, and that's something I think to watch, but also I feel like people weren't as enticed to watch this finals because deep down in their hearts they knew, that the Celtics were gonna dog walk this Mavericks team. You had a lot of people, I think, really contributing to the Mavs in seven, and Mavs winning the whole championship
Right.
thing. I think for the memes, for the laughs,
Yeah.
for the hope
Yeah.
of it. We,
Even
we always
yeah.
see we always see that when a team
Yeah.
is kind of getting
Yes.
dog walked, we see people talk about whatever team in
Yeah.
seven. We
The
saw it last
last two
year.
rounds.
Yeah, we
The
saw it
last
last
two
year.
rounds, we literally had to hear that, and like you said last year, right? Because when we
Yeah,
had teams that were up 3-1, it was like, oh, they're gonna come back. What was it? It was like Lakers Warriors when the Lakers were up 3-1. They're gonna come back, right? I think when Grizzlies, same thing. Or if you look around, right? Like what was that other series? I guess Nuggets Heat, right? Like some people were like, oh, they're gonna come back, or the Celtics actually had a chance,
yeah,
to do it last year, but then they didn't,
yeah. They
right? And
blew
then
it.
like you said for the other series, right? What was it? Mavs Timberwolves,
Yep.
right? Where people were like, there were actually topics about, can they come back down 3-0? Is
Yeah.
it possible?
Wolves
And
in
it's like,
seven.
yeah, and it's like it'll happen at some point, but it will happen when we least expect it. And there will be like a very glaring reason why it happens. You
Yeah,
know what
the
I mean?
league
Like
the
it's
league's
not
not
gonna
ready for that yet.
what?
I said the league's not ready for that yet. We're not there yet.
Yeah, right.
Um,
But
yeah.
go on.
But I'm just saying, like, I think another, like, the other reason is, the Celtics, they're a hated team. I think I'm not going to say they're the most hated team in the NBA, but they're pushing
Hmm.
it, and I think a lot of people don't want to watch them, and I get it. They
Right.
may not play the most exciting brand of basketball, but at the end of the day, like you said, you do have to appreciate it. And another thing, I think another issue is Jason Tatum is the face of that team. For
Hmm.
some reason, a lot of people find him very unlikable, a hateable
Hmm.
guy. I don't think,
Hmm.
we're a part of that at all.
No,
We don't find him corny by
I
any
like Jason
means,
Tatum. I hate that he's a Celtic.
for sure. And I think that's what a lot of people do share. But a lot of people are also on the spectrum of, I hate the Celtics, I hate Jason Tatum because he is a Celtic, all this stuff. Like,
Right.
and I think that kind of contributes to it.
Hmm.
And, like I said, deep down, I think everybody knew this series was over before it started. They just didn't want to admit it, and they just did it for the
Right.
memes. But it is
Yeah.
interesting. I feel like there's so many factors to why, the viewership
Hmm.
is low. And I think, people may not really like the parody aspect of the NBA anymore.
Right.
They may want to
And that's
see, some heavyweight battles, all time battles. Cause
mhm.
I do understand, like, those Warriors Cavs battles, they go down in history. Some people may
Mhm.
not consider this one a historical finals. I know a lot of people haven't. We've already discussed that topic a little bit, but
Yeah.
it is what it is. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but at the end of the
Right.
day, I think this was an enjoyable finals. I enjoyed watching it because
Mhm.
I think, like you talked about, you have to appreciate what they're able to do. Shout out Joe Mazzulla too. I know we didn't talk too much about him and what he's been
Right.
able to do, but I think, he found and they refound their identity versus, it's a completely different team, I think, than the Udoka team and also the one from last year. I think, they chiseled their identity
Yeah.
out. They figured it out. And he's become like an awesome stat guy. I really like, what his discourse is about, the way they win and, their
Yeah.
opportunities, the way they create their opportunities. It's very
Mhm.
efficient and I like it. So shout out
Yeah.
to him
And
as
there's
well.
some. Yeah, there's some articles, that have been written about him recently, and some interviews, right, where like, listen to his quotes, and listen to some of, the stuff that he has to say. And he's a psycho, but like in a good way,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Where it's like you can tell that, he kind of lives and breathes this stuff,
Yeah.
and has a very, unique approach, to coaching and to the game itself, right?
Yeah.
Like, and you could kind of see it, and again, he's a young guy, right? So he kind of had to figure it out and grow as well, right? Because again, obviously for him, right, he was kind of just thrown into the fire, right? Where obviously Udoka was the coach, Then obviously stuff happened, and he was let go. And Missoula wasn't even the top assistant, right? So obviously, again, he was much maligned last year. As we pointed out multiple times, right? For a myriad of reasons. But the team got better, and he got better as well. So you give him a lot of credit, right?
Yeah.
Because obviously, again,
Out-coached Jason Kidd.
right? Yeah, because it's not an easy thing to do, to just kind of be able to go out there and year one or year two, not having a whole lot of prior experience. I know he was an assistant, but that's still different from being a head coach. So it's not the easiest thing in the world to do to just go out there right in your first year or two, and kind of just figure it out, right? But he was able to.
Yeah.
So that's where you give him a lot of credit.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that is kind of an interesting thing where it's like, do people actually like the parody as much as, people say? And, we don't know because there's been cases to be made for, people say super teams are more entertaining to watch because either you really love them and you want to see them win, or you despise them and you want to see them lose. And then people on the other end will argue for parity where, it's, hey, a different team has a chance to win every year. But I guess the thing is that for the most part, like the best team has won, each year, right? Like it's not like we've seen it had a year where like a 5 seed or an 8 seed won a title. It's usually one of the, upper seeds. Like the Celtics had the best record in the NBA. The Nuggets didn't have the best record last year, but they were one in the Western Conference. And they were, the higher seed in the finals compared to the Heat, who were 8. The Warriors, I think, were the 3 seed, but they were pushing the Suns for regular season wins. Then I think they had some injuries the last month or so of the season that kind of took them out of that race. I think the Bucks were 3rd, right? But again, obviously, you had some, weird stuff go on. The Lakers were 1 in the West. They had the bubble, but still. So, it's kind of funny. By the end of the year, I guess it's usually not a surprise who ends up winning. Usually it's one of the teams that has a really good season where, and like you said, people say the regular season doesn't matter, but you still have to win, right? Like, and I think it's important at the very least if you take the regular season seriously, because, as we'll get into the next segment, right, we know that there were some teams that did not take the regular season quite as seriously, as a team like Boston, and they paid for it, right? They paid the price for it. So, obviously when people mention, like, all the games that the Celtics won, like, it put them in the position for it to be, more of a quote-unquote cakewalk as people would describe, right? Like, if you have the top record, you're not going to play as many, like, really, really good teams, right? Like, in the first round, you're playing an 8 seed.
Right.
Which is a lot different than if you're the 4 seed and you're playing 5, or if you're the 6 seed playing the 3 seed or something like that. So, that's the main thing, right? Like usually the first 2 rounds aren't as difficult for the higher seeds, because the seeds are lower.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. So now
oh boy,
we're getting into, the other meat of this episode, right? This was something we did last year. And it took up most of the episode, right? It was a lot. But basically right now we're going to give grades, for each team, during the season. Right now we have it spread out where we're going to do it basically kind of in the postseason tier order, right? Where we're starting with the finals teams and then we're going to work our way down, all the way down to the bottom feeders. So obviously, the grade is going to be different for each team because each team's in a different situation. I'm sure we're probably going to have some that are very similar, some that are probably going to be different, maybe not very different, but they might be, because we don't know what each person gave the grade for. But, we're going to go through these, right, and obviously kind of, give a little, brief thing of, each grade and why we gave them that. So we'll start with the Boston Celtics. Pretty simple one, A+. We've, just like we did last year with the Nuggets, when you win the title, doesn't matter how you did it, doesn't matter how difficult or how easy it is. When you win the title, you get an A+, because that's the ultimate goal. So there's no way you could give a team lower than that. So pretty simple there.
Yeah, A+. They won the title. Look at the roster. Look at the way they won the title. Awesome. They did it. Yeah, like Jason Tatum said, we did it. All that stuff. So yeah, A+ for them.
Yeah. So that was a quick one, right?
Yeah.
So next up, the Mavs. So this one, I was nice, I guess, and I gave them an A because obviously they didn't win the NBA Finals, but they still had a very good season, right? It's Luka's first NBA Finals. So obviously, right, that's, something that should be celebrated. And obviously, yeah, like it was weird in terms of how the overall season started, because they started off really good. Then they kind of leveled off. I think by the time they made the trades, I think they were a play-in team. And then, they elevated the team, with the trades that they made at the deadline. They were great trades as we went over, during the live stream and during the episodes after that. Changed the, formation and the shape of the team on both ends of the floor. So yeah, they didn't win the finals, but they still made it to the finals, and they had a really good season that I think was better than most people expected. Like if you went into the season and thought, what is the ceiling for this Mavs team going into the season? I don't think it would have necessarily been NBA Finals. So they overachieved, I would say, over the course of the season, and so they get an A from me.
Yeah, they weathered the storm. They rallied. They changed the complete roster construction, around the second half of the season. They got to the NBA Finals. I think that's enough to warrant them, an A- range. It's just I feel like that Finals performance was a little bit underwhelming from a couple of guys, but the postseason run I think was awesome. You saw a lot of guys elevate, but the problem is I think it was a fluctuation versus like Boston where they kind of felt very consistent, calm and composed, whereas, with the Mavs, sometimes you had a series where PJ Washington was the number one guy at times. And then you had other ones where Kyrie disappeared, Luka as well. So, I think overall, though, a good showing for sure. And, you can't really get much better than that.
Yeah. Now we're going to the second tier of teams, right? So these would be the other conference finalists. That didn't go all the way, right? So we have the Pacers. We'll start with them. I'm gonna give them an A. You could give them an A plus if you wanted to, right? Either one. But I think they also were kind of an overachieving team as well, right? They went to the conference finals, which I don't think most people expected. Now they had some things go their way as well, right? Like obviously in the first round, didn't have to play Giannis, even though they played the Bucks, and I think Lillard was out. Doesn't matter, right? Played. A Knicks team that kind of just fell apart health-wise by the end, but again, doesn't matter because a lot of teams will get those opportunities over the course of a season, and you got to take advantage of them. So they did. They got swept by the Celtics, but those games were, they were competitive, right? It was a competitive sweep, right? I know that's a term that a lot of people like to make fun of, but it was, right? They were in, pretty much all those games except for game 2. Even the last 2 games where Halliburton didn't even play. Right, those games could have gone either way, but I think we, thought the Celtics would probably pull it out. But either way, you still give them a lot of credit. They made the trade for Siakam without really having to give up anything of significance, other than some picks that they're probably not going to miss. And then what was it, Bruce Brown, Jason Noir. So you got an all-star guy for basically very little. So that was a great trade, and he was a big part of their success in the postseason. So yeah, that's my grade from them.
Yeah, A for awesome. I think they had a great season, great postseason as well. And I think, they've also given themselves a lot of flexibility and room to grow, for sure, and coming off of this season. But, if we're sticking to, just this season and their postseason, yeah, I think they showed up in the moments that, they needed to. And, everybody knew that they were not going to beat Boston. I thought the series was going to be a little bit more competitive just because of what, they are able to do. And, to be fair, they did put up, I think, the best fight in terms of the point differentials and scoring and all that stuff. They looked like they could have actually, gotten a couple games versus the Mavs where it's like, all right, you got one, so I think, you do walk away feeling pretty confident about what Indiana did. And I think, they're legit. That's another thing. Like, that's why I feel like they should also get an A.
Yeah. And then for the Wolves, I know how their season ended. I know that it didn't look great. I know that a lot of funny stuff happened, but I'm still going to give them an A because this was their best season in franchise history.
Yeah.
I know they went to the conference finals in 2004. I think they got swept, if I'm not mistaken. But, this time around, they got a win, right? This was the furthest that this team's ever gotten. I think, obviously, we saw a lot of good stuff from Anthony Edwards. Wasn't great in the conference finals, but still, I think he obviously showed, what I think a lot of us already knew, right? That he's a rising superstar. Obviously, the team, still kind of a strange fit between Towns and Gobert, but they tried to make it work as best as they could over the course of the season. So again, like I said, it's kind of like the Mavs, where it's like I know how the season ended, where it kind of felt like the end of their season was pretty underwhelming, but I don't think we should just kind of forget and throw out all the stuff prior to that. So, like I said, I know that it feels kind of weird maybe to some people, but I think, they get an A. So
Yeah.
that's kind of cool that like all the top 4 teams basically all get good grades.
Yeah, I'm giving them an A minus.
Mhm.
I'm a little bit more critical on them deeper in their
Sure.
run, but I think the culmination and everything, from the regular season up until, they did face the Mavs in the conference finals, I think was awesome. We kind of got to see the arrival of Anthony Edwards. Towns was on a stretch where he looked pretty good, Gobert as well. And then, once we get to the conference finals, albeit, it was difficult. They had a really rough path, I think. A little bit more challenging than some other teams on this list, but they tried their best. They did their best, I think, in terms of what their limitations were at the time. But I think the potential is through the roof. So A minus for them.
Yeah. Now we're going, back to, the other teams, right? So we're going back to the East again, for those second round teams, right? And we have the Cavs first. This one I'm kind of split on, but I'm gonna give them a B. I
Really?
guess. I think I'm gonna give them a B. I think I'm gonna give them a B because I was not super high on this team anyways. And they did get out of the first round, which is an accomplishment for them because they didn't do it last year. They did lose in 5 to the Celtics, but I felt like this was probably their ceiling anyways, especially if, their second round opponent, is the Celtics. And they put up a fight, in some of those games, right? Like some of those games were more competitive than the Mavs games, to be honest. Even without Donovan Mitchell and without Jared Allen. So I think you have to look at it that way. Obviously, they fired their coach, so that doesn't necessarily make you feel all that awesome. But I will say also like Garland struggled, but I do like kind of what I saw from Mobley. In the latter part of the postseason against the Celtics, I think he got better. I think Mitchell was really good, but at the same time, like I said, this one I feel like is a more controversial one. But like I said, the only reason I'm giving him a B was because it was an improvement from last year, even though it doesn't really feel like it at all. But I understand if people want to go lower because there were some other ugly things, and it never feels good to fire your coach and say like we had a great season. So so that's where there's probably some flaws there. But like I said, I'm willing to overlook some of it.
Yeah, I'm going C for Cleveland. Yeah, this team I think underachieved. If you want me to be
Okay.
honest, I know, like you said, getting out of that first round, awesome feeling for sure. But then you come
Right.
out of the second round, I think, with more questions than last year.
Hmm.
You lose your coach. Now it's, does Donovan Mitchell sign the extension? Darius
Hmm.
Garland, what happens with him? Jared Allen, I guess you know what you have in Mobley at this point.
Hmm.
Yeah, just too many questions, I think.
Yeah.
And it took them what? Was it I think it was 7 games for them to get
Yeah.
past Orlando, which,
Right.
I mean, picked Orlando, so that kind of tells you
Right.
how I was feeling
That
about
was a
Cleveland
coin
in the
flip
first.
of a series.
Sure. And it's
And
like,
honestly,
what's up?
remember, that was a game where they were getting whooped in the first half. So, it honestly, if they hadn't gotten out of the first round, I would have given them like a D, if
Yeah,
I'm
for
going to be
sure.
honest.
Yeah, and that's kind of why
Yeah.
I'm giving them a C. I think it was just an average season. I think they
Mhm.
showed a lot of promise in the regular season. They looked really
Yeah.
good in the regular season at times, but in the postseason, they kind of just fell apart, crumbled, and that could
Mhm.
be due to a multitude of reasons.
Sure.
But also losing your coach and firing him, I think also knocks them down a peg. Because I probably would have put them
Yeah.
around B minus, but they're in that
Right.
C to C plus range for me.
Yeah. And I think that's pretty fair too, right? Because it's like, do we look at them any differently than we did a year ago? Like, probably not. Like,
No,
maybe you might feel better about a guy like Mobley, but you still don't necessarily feel like, is this a real contender in the East?
right?
So that's where I think, like, yeah, like that's where I feel like the C does, that's a good one. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
we weren't that far apart, but
yeah.
it does feel like it because it's like I feel like the Cavs had a pretty polarizing season.
Yeah, like I said, great regular season,
Yeah.
sketchy, fraudulent postseason, where it's like, all
Right.
right, are you really even a 4 seed? That's
Yeah.
they didn't look like it to me.
Yeah, and that's fair. Where it's also like that's a team where like, you would think in terms of internally they're judging things based off the postseason more so. So that's
Exactly.
a good point as
Yeah,
well.
that's why
Um,
Bickerstaff got fired, 100%.
yeah, Knicks. I'm gonna say B,
Really?
B
Okay.
plus.
Okay.
I think for them, I mean, they basically got as far as they did last year, right? So they went to the second round last year as well. Much more competitive series, right? I know, well, last year was 6, this one was 7. I forgot. Now we have to say this season is last season. That's
Yeah.
kind of funny, but either way,
Yeah, it's crazy,
like,
right?
yeah, I think made some great moves at over the course of the season, right? They brought in Anunoby, right? The guys that they brought in after that at the deadline didn't work out quite as much, mainly because Bogdanovich got hurt. And Burks, he didn't really play at all until the Pacers series. So that one feels a lot more sketchy, I think, the more you look at it. But obviously the Anunoby one was great. Because he was a big part of their run. It just kind of sucks the way that it ended, because I think both you and I feel like if they were healthy, then they would have gotten to the conference finals. Probably still don't beat the Celtics, but either way, right? Like, they're still a really good team. They had a really good season. So, like I said, B plus. Only if they had gotten to the conference finals, I probably would have given them an A, because then I would have been like, oh, they did better than last year. But at the same time, like, by the time they were basically playing guys on one leg, that probably wasn't realistic. But I still would say this was a really good season for the Knicks. And I think, this team, right? I think this is a really good team to build around, compared to like where they were like a few years ago, where it's like, now it's not Julius Randle, now it's Jalen Brunson. And I think we also learned some other stuff, right? Like, now Jalen Brunson can be one of those guys, which, I feel like you and I already kind of thought anyways. But I think this postseason run cemented it even more.
Yeah, since the moment he's arrived in New York, I think we felt that he could be, legit. And that's why I'm giving them an A. I think they reaped the benefits of every move that they made this season. Unfortunately, they just got hit with a huge injury bug that just, made them spiral out of control. But I think you saw a lot of guys elevate, a lot of guys who necessarily aren't stars kind of elevate into a stardom role, especially in the postseason. I know we're talking a lot about postseason, but I think the Knicks postseason really does elevate, because I think there's so much potential there, untapped, unknown, because we don't know what they look like healthy in the postseason. So I give them an A for sure. And they also finished, second in the East, albeit weak, very weak East, but still number 2 seed. I think you have to kind of give them an A.
Yeah. I think that's a good one.
Yeah, I don't blame you for giving them a B though. I wouldn't.
Yeah, I have them at a B plus, so it's pretty close.
Yeah, I wouldn't be mad at that.
Next one, the Denver Nuggets. So
yeah, this is a rough one.
I'm kind of going back and forth between a C plus and a B minus. I'll lean towards B minus, but I feel like the way that the season ended just feels like such a letdown in comparison to how most of the season was. Because I think, it felt like you kind of went back and forth on, are they better than last year or not? And, in the first round, right, the warning signs were there, right? Because obviously right towards the end of the postseason, right towards the end of the regular season, they had the loss to the Spurs. So you could say that Wemby kind of basically destroyed the Nuggets season and changed the NBA timeline this year. But either way, and Devontae Graham, my bad. But either way, yeah, like the first round against the Lakers, right? They won in 5, but that series felt just kind of strange, where it's like, it felt like they shouldn't have even been in some of those situations they were in, and that was probably the warning sign right there. The big thing was, I think Jamal Murray had a, significantly worse postseason than he did the year before, right? Obviously, not every game was bad, but I think the big concern was, the shot making consistency just wasn't necessarily there. Especially when, obviously he was able to come through at the end of the Lakers series. But in Minnesota, he had some rough moments. Obviously had the heat pack thing that wasn't great. And then I still just can't get over the fact that they had a 20-point lead in the second half of a game 7, and then just it all went away, right? Like, I don't know what really happened there. Like, again, you give credit to the Wolves for, not giving up and, pushing through, but it just, watching it in real time was just very bizarre, because it felt like that game was kind of over, where it felt like the Nuggets were going to just pull it out and win, and then the Wolves just came back, in a fury. And that's where I feel like, the pivot point kind of changed, right? Because if they had gone to the conference finals, and lost, maybe you might feel differently. But, losing in the second round is kind of where, like I said, I'm going back and forth between B minus, C plus, especially just the way that it felt. But, they still had a good regular season, but it just felt like there were some, points where they left some things on the table, right? Because like I said, just losing that second to last regular season game that put them in the 2 seed as opposed to the 1 seed, which kind of changed how they were going to be able to run through the postseason. And then just like I said, the way they blew Game 7, just kind of rough. I understand back to back is hard. They were probably fatigued, but it felt kind of like a disappointing title defense to me. Although you could say losing in Game 7 is nothing to really be upset about, but it just felt like the way that it happened was just rough. Like if you had lost on like some ridiculous buzzer beater, that'd be one thing. But just to blow a 20-point second half lead, I don't know. I don't really love that. But at the same time, again, it's whatever at this point. I'm still kind of just questioning it.
Going into the season, I was in love with this team. During the regular season, I thought they were awesome. Maybe not the same team from last year. I thought they were awesome. Postseason, though, that's a huge anchor to their grade, I think. So I give them a C.
Okay.
Very bad. I think the first round, okay, cool. You skated by, but you also handled business. But also Jamal Murray, he was there, but he wasn't there, if that makes sense. Like he had his moments, which is awesome. That's kind of like what he does. But we've seen him do it better. So that kind of scared me. But then I thought, Minnesota's unproven. What are they going to do? They did a lot. So, Minnesota, them losing, I think, to Minnesota in 7 games was for sure kind of like the big anchor that knocked them down, to a C. Just because
the way it happened.
Yeah, it's like you're the defending champs. You're supposed to be a little bit more calm, poised. You're supposed to know what you're doing. But at the same time, the Minnesota Timberwolves are the anti-Nuggets, so I get it. That team was built and designed to, destroy the Denver Nuggets, and they did that. So, at the end of the day, it is what it is. But yeah, C for them.
Yeah, it makes you feel a little bit more uncertain about the team. Like, not whether or not they can contend, but just more so like, okay, what do we expect out of them next season, right? Like, do we expect them, to just get out of the West? Do we think it's more likely that they get out early? Like, it adds on more questions, kind of like you said about the Cavs. Different tiers, obviously, right? Because the Nuggets have already won a title, and we know they can contend. But like you said, the pivot point for me, and like I said, the pivot point was when they, lost that Game 7.
Yeah.
Right?
Great.
Like, because, losing in the conference finals, like, yeah, it would suck if you lost to the Mavs, I guess, because I think most people would have picked the Nuggets to beat the Mavs. But, a title defense where you lose in the conference finals, that's fine, right? Like, and not that losing in the second round is bad, because all the previous, repeat teams or teams that tried to go back-to-back went out in the second round as well. But with those teams, you could kind of just tell that they weren't as good the following year, right? Or there was some other reason. Like for the Bucks, they lost Chris Middleton in the second round against the Celtics, right? For the Lakers, right? AD missed half of, that series, right? What was it? For Golden State, right? Like, they got older, right? Draymond had the punch. You had some weird stuff that happened, right? So you could just feel that most of those teams weren't as good. But this one you really thought had the most potential to go back to back, and they blew it. Like, to me, that was a choke job.
Yeah, they
like,
stunk.
I don't know what happened.
C for choke. Perfect.
Yeah. You know what? Yeah, I'm gonna bump it from B minus.
Yeah, bump it down, bro. It's got to be a C. It has to be. Whether it be C minus, C, C plus, something. It can't be B though.
Yeah. Thunder, gonna give them an A, right?
Okay.
Because I think, just based off of, I know they were the 1 seed and they lost in the second round, but I also was kind of surprised going into the year that they were a 1 seed anyways. They won a ton of games. Obviously, they had some good luck in terms of health. Obviously, you're coming off the postseason with some questions, about certain guys. But I think, overall, in terms of what you would typically see in terms of the progression of a young team, I think you like the fact that they went from basically a team that didn't make the playoffs at all, they were in the play-in, to, a 50-win team that got to the second round, right? Like, obviously, they lost to the Mavs. But, the Mavs also had some more seasoned guys, and this is kind of what's supposed to happen, right? Like, I know we picked OKC to beat Dallas, but I don't necessarily I didn't walk out of that series, thinking, oh, man, OKC's in trouble. Like, I think, obviously they kind of disappointed us in the sense that we thought they were going to win, but I think there were still a lot of positives. I think, obviously, SGA, right, who some people might have had questions about, clearly showed that his stuff that he does in the regular season still carries over, right? Like he's still one of those guys. Chet obviously didn't do as well against Dallas, but like, you can clearly see the talent in terms of why he went number 2 overall, in terms of what he can do on both ends of the floor. Jalen Williams, right? Struggled against the Mavs, but over the course of the season, right, really showed some growth. You got some good rookies, right, like Cason Wallace. Obviously, some other guys struggled, like Josh Giddey, but I think there was a lot to like about the OKC team. But if somebody wants to give him like a B or something like that, I don't really have an issue with that. It's just, I'm kind of factoring in like, also like what were my expectations versus like what did I end up getting?
Yeah, I had them at a B, but I think
Okay.
your reasoning was very good for an A, so I'm gonna bump it up
Mhm.
pretty much for the same
Mhm.
reasons. I think Shea, like you said, proved himself for sure because a lot of people said he's a fraud, it wasn't gonna carry
Mhm.
over. Well, it sure did. I think you just walk away with a little bit of I think you walk away thinking that this team has a lot of potential, considering the options on their team. They made an interesting move, which we'll talk
Yeah.
about in a little bit, which I think, will help them down the line as well. But sticking to this season, yeah, they got the number 1 seed in the West. Awesome. I think that's A material for them.
Yeah. The Heat. Now we're moving on to the first round teams, right? So the teams that were first round exits. So the Heat. Uh, oh man. Um, I'm gonna be nice,
Okay.
and I'm gonna say D. I know it's a low grade. I know that there were some things to like, right? Because
Yeah.
obviously, I think what you got from Hawkes was really cool, right? I think Bam obviously showed some growth, right? He was an all star. He had a really good season. Um, I liked what they did, I guess, at the deadline where you turned Kyle Lowry into Rozier. Didn't really play a whole lot, but I think you can say that was a solid trade. Um, I just think it's rough, right? Because they went to the finals last year. We didn't expect them to go back. But obviously, like, not being able to get Damian Lillard felt like kind of was the pivot point for them, where it's like then it kind of changed a lot of the math of what they were probably going to do, right? Because, then they kind of had to pivot and do some other stuff, and it just didn't work, right? Like, they weren't a terrible team, right? They were, what, an 8 seed or whatever it was, above 500, right? So wins record wise, not really much different from last year. They went out in the first round and got swept. But what do you expect, right? They didn't have Jimmy Butler. They didn't have Terry Rozier. So that factors in as well. But yeah, this, going from the finals to being swept in the first round, kind of hard for me to give them a high grade, even though, like I said, there were some positives. But I don't know. Maybe that might be being too mean. But yeah, I'm going to give them that D.
Yeah, I gave them a C minus.
Okay.
It was mainly because of the injuries. I think there was a long stretch during the regular season
Mhm.
where we didn't see them healthy at all, and it just made
Yeah.
you feel horrible. Then you go to the postseason, it continues. I think the roster had
Mhm.
potential, not necessarily
Yeah.
potential to win the finals, but potential to make a run in the playoffs because of the talent that they
Mhm.
do have, especially in Jimmy Butler. But he was not available for the postseason, so I think that knocks
Mhm.
them down a letter grade. And when they were healthy, they didn't look too cohesive as well. So I do
Mhm.
understand, giving out the D, letter grade, but I can't do it. I'll give them a C
Okay.
minus though.
All right.
Yeah.
Next up, the Milwaukee Bucks.
Oh, I've been waiting for this one.
So, I'm going back and forth
Mm-hmm.
between a couple of grades,
Mm-hmm.
right? Initially, I thought C,
Mm-hmm.
but then I was kind of thinking D.
Mm-hmm.
But now I'm kind of wondering if I almost should probably bump it down to F. Um, and I feel like I might have to actually go with an F.
Yeah.
Now, to be fair, right? I know that Giannis was hurt. I know that Lillard, had the Achilles thing going on in the postseason. But I was very disappointed by what I saw from the team this season. I know that they ended as the 3 seed, but I thought they were going to be better. Obviously, they had the injuries, but even in the regular season, other than a couple of stretches, they never really felt as good as you thought they would be. So I think the combination of that and the postseason going out in the first round, is kind of what would I would where I would lean towards F. Like, and maybe that's just kind of unfair, but like also you went out in the first round. So and I'm like you made a big trade to acquire Lillard, which was nice. We had concerns about their defense, but we still thought that they would, end up doing better than what we expected, right? Like we thought that it would probably be them and the Celtics, and it wasn't. So, that's the tough part. Obviously, like I said, injuries are a big factor, but I don't know. Like if you think the injury thing is unfair, bump it up to a D, but, I'm giving them an F cuz I was pretty disappointed by what I saw this season. Obviously, like a couple of the young guys were cool, but that's about it. And obviously Giannis had a great season too, to be fair, before he got hurt.
Yeah, F is for frauds who do stuff together, because that team was just not the answer, bro. And we talked about it, from the moment they landed Lillard, from the moment the season started. I was like, this team is not going anywhere, albeit the injuries happened. But then the whole Doc Rivers thing happening, the Adrian Griffin firing, I think that kind of just spelled doom. Dame coming there, obviously taking a little bit of a step back at times, which was kind of to be expected, when you are playing number 2 for the first time in your career. Also losing out on Drew Holiday, I think impacted this team beyond belief. And you see the impact that they were missing, and you see the impact that he provided to the Celtics, which is why they got an A+, and this team got an F, because, you look at where the two teams ended for the season. Celtics win the title. Milwaukee goes out in the first round. So not very good. Like you said, to go for an all-in move and then that guy doesn't really do anything for you in the playoffs. Hey, that's a failure. So, fraudulent failure team. I'm sure they'll be back next year. If they make some additions, some movement, they need to change something up. But that roster is currently constructed. It's never going to win a title.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, again, similar to a couple of these other teams, we have more questions than answers now about this team.
Yeah.
Because, what did we learn about this team this season is that they're probably not good enough. But at the same time, they weren't healthy, but also, they do have some older guys on the roster, so it's kind of hard to necessarily expect much better health, from a lot of those guys, right? Because, again, Lillard's older, Middleton's older, Lopez is older. So, what are you going to get out of those guys, over the course of, an 82-game season plus the postseason? Oh, wow.
Yeah, you saw that Woj bomb, right?
Yeah, we got a Woj bomb. So Malik Monk signed a 4-year, $78 million deal. Wow. To stay in Sacramento. Wow. Yeah. So that's kind of wild that we actually got, one of those big notifications in the middle of recording.
Yeah, that's actually funny.
Cool. Right, so that obviously changes something. 4-year, $78 million deal. So that obviously changes some things. That takes him off the free agency market.
He's a big
for
target.
A lot of those teams, because we thought that he might leave and chase a bag somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because obviously we had mentioned on the live stream that these teams can renegotiate with their with their own free agents. We'll have another one that I guess we'll talk about. As we get a little further, that had already been out, but. Kind of an interesting thing. I guess we kind of have to mention, if you're the Kings, that's huge, right? Because, they could have easily lost him. He was a big part of their team. But now you get to keep him, right? 4 years, $78 million, which, that's cool, right? That's basically about 20 a year. Yeah. So, which is good, right? Obviously that means that he gets to, at least for now, stay in Sacramento and continue to be a part of that group. And I think that would have been a big loss for the Kings if they had just lost him for nothing. But now you get to keep him. So
yeah, I think that's a fair team-friendly deal. It doesn't hurt you by any means, and gives you some flexibility as well. To maybe move on from Harrison Barnes or something like that. But yeah, way to retain your guy and bring him back, because I think he is one of their best players.
Right. So obviously, there were some people that thought that he might leave, and that didn't happen.
Yeah,
so.
I thought he was gone.
Yeah, so now back to our, team grading regularly scheduled program, Philadelphia 76ers. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually going to zag, and I'm going to let you take this one because you are the resident Philadelphia 76ers Joel Embiid fan. Uh-huh. So I'm going to let you, because I want to hear your thoughts first. Before I go.
Sure. Well, if I could spell, Philadelphia with an F, I could, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm giving them an F. Them being the number 7 seed, I think was a huge disappointment. Obviously, Joel Embiid's health was always a question, especially, throughout the season. But, you look at it, the postseason was not spectacular. They didn't look good. I think you have some bright spots in Tyrese Maxey. Tobias Harris looked horrible. There were just stretches where they didn't look like a very well composed, put together team. And like I said,
Mm.
that's because Embiid wasn't there at times. But
Mhm.
I don't know. I'm just not high on this team at all. I'm
Mhm.
not high on Embiid clearly. And I just think at this point, I'm not saying like he's like a horrible player or anything like that. I just think he's
Mhm.
slightly overrated because he's never around, and when he is around, he kind of shrinks up in the biggest moments, which is
Mhm.
not what you really want from your superstar. But to be fair, the roster construction was very bare bones. Maybe F is a little bit too harsh because I think they do have a lot of
Mhm.
assets going into the next season that they did
Right.
kind of retain throughout this season. So I guess there
Mhm.
is a positive in that. But even then, it doesn't make me feel too confident because no matter what they do and no matter what they get, they're not winning the title. Like as long as
Mhm.
Embiid's on that team, because he probably won't even play in the finals, even if they do get there. That's how I feel about this team. And yeah, just them being 7 hurts their stock a lot, I think. But going into next season, if Embiid is healthy, probably won't be.
Mhm.
That'll they can bounce back from an F easily. But for me, failure of a season. You wasted
Yeah,
another Embiid year. You wasted it.
I gave him a D only because I like the Tyrese Maxey stuff from this
Yeah,
season.
it
That
was
was,
awesome.
outside, and also like the Harden trade gave them, the cap flexibility. So I liked that as well. And when Embiid and Maxey were healthy, I thought that was good. But like you said, it's hard to give them a high grade because they went out in the first round, which is actually lower than what they normally do, right? Because usually it's the second round exit.
Yep.
But this time it was first round. Obviously, it's tough because Embiid wasn't healthy,
Mm-hmm.
right? Had a meniscus injury and had to come back from that.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if we factored in injuries for the other teams and gave them low grades as well. So I think it's only fair to kind of do that for Philly too.
Mm-hmm.
Orlando, I'm gonna give him an A. Because of the fact that I think we liked what we saw in the offseason. We liked the team going into the year. I think we thought they would be a play-in team, but on like the higher end, obviously, right? But they actually ended up exceeding that, right? They were the 5 seed, um, and I think over the course of the regular season, if stuff had gone their way, they may have been able to go higher, right? And actually, they started the year off as one of the top 2 seeds, right? But 5 seed, I think, sounds about right in terms of where based off of how their season was, where they would finish. I think you saw some good stuff. I think Paolo took a big leap forward.
Yeah.
So that's obviously awesome. Franz Wagner, I think, had a down year, mainly in terms of the 3-point shooting. But I think outside of that, I think you like, Jamal Mosley. I mean, again, maybe some stuff in the postseason you didn't necessarily like. But I think just in terms of like your main guy, Paolo, taking that leap forward, and Jalen Suggs also having a big, year as well, right? He was on All NBA defense, right? So obviously that means he took a big step forward as well. So, like I said, even though Franz took a step back, I think you liked a lot of what you saw from the rest of the group. And obviously, you liked what you saw over the course of the regular season, even though they did go out in the first round. But it was their first year of postseason experience. Also, Jonathan Isaac, right? Being healthy and having a productive year as well. I think that was huge too. So, they get an A from me.
Yeah, I give them a B, and the reason why
Okay.
is because A for regular season, C for postseason, kind of averages out. Got to give them a
Yeah.
B. I just didn't
Okay.
like what I saw in the postseason. They kind of let me down.
Yeah.
And to be fair, I can't really hold that against them too hard because, like you said, this is this team's first postseason run. But I think Paolo's underrated. You have some great pieces. You have a lot of flexibility, and you still have your future, which is awesome. You just do have to make some decisions in terms of your guards, which should be intriguing in what they do with that. But yeah, I think the teams, the sky's the limit for this team. It's just
Hmm.
a matter of time. But yeah, like the thing that brought me back down to earth with them was probably like Franz and just their postseason run in general.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's fair.
Yeah.
But I think, in overall, I think the Magic season was positive where you feel good about the team. So that's where, like, even though, yeah, they lost in the first round, I think that's where, the grades kind of edge out. So I think a B, at worst is fine. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like
Yeah.
anything less than a B is kind of but, I think that's fine. That's
Yeah.
more than fair.
Yeah.
Because like you said, you would like to factor in regular season and postseason as well. I think some of it maybe kind of depends on the team, right? Like the Sixers and the Bucks going out in the first round is a lot worse than Orlando. just because of where they're at. But like you said, there was some stuff in the postseason that we didn't like, right? Because Franz Wagner, right? He had a rough Game 7, one of the worst you will ever see. And some of that, there were warning signs because he couldn't shoot over the course of the regular season, which was weird, which was bizarre. Still don't really understand it. But, I think overall as a whole from their young players, there's a lot to like.
Yeah.
Phoenix, moving on to the Western Conference first round teams. F. That is all. No, I'm joking.
Yeah, literally.
But either way, I'm not joking about an F. But in terms of like the explanation, right? Like they made some swings, right? Obviously, they lost to the Nuggets last year in the second round in 6. Right? They traded for Durant last year's deadline. Which was nice, right? They didn't, they gave up some picks. They gave up Bridges and Cam Johnson, right? But you felt cool about it in terms of the regular season stuff. They lost to the Nuggets, which was, I guess, disappointing. But you kind of wondered what they were going to do because we talked about they probably are going to have to try to move on from like Chris Paul, maybe Ayton, and split up those guys and bring in other players. And they moved them all right? They swapped Chris Paul for Bradley Beal. Don't really know why. And he's not a bad player at all. Just doesn't really make a lot of sense on this team. DeAndre Ayton, they traded for, what was it? Yusuf Nurkic, Grayson Allen, and Nasir Little, right? Little didn't do much. Nurkic was fine over the course of the regular season, but didn't do a whole lot in the postseason. Grayson Allen had a great regular season, right? Led the league in 3-point percentage, and then got hurt in the first round and didn't really do a whole lot before that anyways, in the first round. So, yeah, they made some interesting moves, some big swings. I think we liked what they did in the offseason, right, where we liked a lot of their minimum contract signings, and then they were able to parlay that into Royce O'Neal, who's, better than a minimum contract. But then in the postseason, they fell apart, right? They had a very disappointing postseason where I think we both thought they were going to beat Minnesota. Because in the regular season, they played them very well, right? They won all 4 matchups in pretty convincing fashion as well. And then the reverse happened. Then they got swept in pretty convincing fashion. So now, it's kind of hard to feel really good about this team because now in the offseason, they're going to be in that second apron again, and they're going to have a lot less flexibility than they did before. They won't be able to take individual contracts and aggregate them into other players. They may lose some guys that they have on the roster already. We don't know about Eric Gordon and some other guys. And they're not going to be able to bring in anybody that amazing anyway. So, but obviously, this is based off of this season. And yeah, you made all those big moves and you get swept in the first round. Don't really know you could give much better than an F. Obviously, I guess, Durant had a really good season. So that's cool, despite his age. Booker obviously transitioned to point guard, but still had a really good year. Beal, honestly, for what it was worth, when he was healthy, had a good regular season. I guess, considering what you might have expected, but at the same time, makes a lot of money. And in the postseason, this is where, like you said, you got to factor in both the regular season and the postseason, and the postseason was a disaster.
Yeah. Once again, same situation with Philly. If I could spell Phoenix with an F, I could, and I will. So Phoenix gets an F. Like you said, I think I like the things that Book brought to the table. KD, even Beal. It's just once that postseason hit, these guys just disappeared. They didn't have an answer for Minnesota, and maybe Minnesota wasn't the best, opponent, even though the regular season numbers for sure said that they were. It's rough, but you took, you struck out. You swung 3 times and you missed all 3 times. So you're out. So that's kind of just how I feel about Phoenix. I don't know really what they could do from here. I think, it's tough because your hands are now tied. You're paying, a lot of money for Bradley Beal, Kevin Durant, and Devin Booker, who at this point are kind of an unproven, trio. And before that, it was an unproven duo. So,
right.
Now you're just adding more uncertainty and overpay onto a roster that, probably didn't need that at this point. But hey, it is what it is. Yeah, F for these guys.
Yep. Moving on, the Clippers. Yeah. This one is weird because it's like, I guess, considering what ended up happening, with Kawhi's injury, I guess that's like, okay, what were they really supposed to do? but it's still kind of hard to give him really a high grade. Maybe you give him a D, or an F, whichever one, take your pick. I guess, you know, I don't know. The regular season was good, I think, for the most part. So, yeah, that's cool. But then also at the same time, playoffs, same thing happened again, you know? So I'm probably going to lean towards F. But I mean, if somebody wants to give him a D and be nice, that's fine. It's just, again, what did we really learn about this team? Pretty much that they're the same thing that we've been seeing the last several years, right? Obviously, they added Harden. When they all were together, they had a stretch where they were dominant and they looked like the best team in the NBA or one of the best teams in the NBA. Then post All-Star break, all fell apart, right? The defense just completely fell off a cliff. Don't really know what happened. And then, they kind of bounced back, right? Kawhi was hurt to close the regular season. And they won enough games, to not completely fall apart, right? So they, kind of rebounded and fell into the 4th seed. But then they lost in the first round again. And it's like, now, what do we expect, right? Like Paul George, does he stay or he goes? I mean, he didn't really play that great against the Mavs aside from like a couple of games. So not really a whole lot changes there. Harden, he was fine, I guess, at certain points. But, at the same time, this group feels like the window may have closed, but they also might end up running it back. And maybe if, things are different, maybe they'll be better. But I don't know. Just because of like the same stuff happened again, again, like you could give them a D. But I mean, first round exit for another team that's, supposed to be a contender, it's kind of hard to really give them, much better than one of those two grades.
C for clipped. Yeah,
Okay.
not a huge fan of what happened, but I think their regular season was so awesome.
Okay.
The majority of it, I think, that's kind of what puts them a little bit higher, but I would give them like an A for their regular season, F for their postseason. So what does that average out to? Probably around a C,
That's probably fair.
Yeah, and it's like I like their pieces. That's the thing. I like their pieces. I like their potential, but that championship window is closing, and then going into the rebrand on a low note is also a pretty big stinger, I think. So that doesn't help your case at all. But you do go into this with a lot of questions, so maybe I'm being a little bit too nice, but I would say C.
Yeah. I guess I'll move it up to D because I do think the Harden trade, obviously it looks kind of weird, but, it made sense and they didn't really have to give up a lot. I know they gave up a couple of picks or whatever, but, that was fine. They brought in Daniel Tice. All right, that's fine. After that, didn't really do a whole lot, but, they couldn't really do a whole lot anyways. But like you said, I think it's the difference between the postseason and the regular season that's rough. Because, during the regular season, at least during the earlier part, they looked awesome. And then after that, don't know what happened. Just kind of clipped out.
Yeah. Yeah, they're 50 team or 50 win team, but I don't know. Curse, clipped,
Right.
I don't know.
And that's the weird thing about the Western Conference is there were so many teams that, had winning records, but they were also but they still were lower seeds. So it's a lot different than, so being like the 10th seed in the West is a lot different than being the 10th seed in the East. But the result is basically the same because you're out of the playoffs.
Right.
But also the expectations are different. Next up, Lakers. I'm giving them an F. That's my team. Maybe that might be harsh, but this was a team kind of like some of those other ones where we thought they'd be better. Their regular season, wasn't bad. They won 47 games or what?
Yeah, you went 47,
yeah, exactly.
35.
Which was actually an improvement over last season. But it felt like the improvement just wasn't enough. Obviously, there was some weird things at the beginning of the season, right? They started, some guys that we were kind of surprised they were starting, right? They started Torian Prince, who started in the preseason. But it didn't necessarily work in the starting five, next to the, the two guys in the backcourt. Eventually they started Rui, right? So obviously, and that was kind of where their winning started, but it kind of came too late. And then they ended up going against the Nuggets in the first round. This series was also close, even though it was a 5-game series. But you kind of knew how it was going to end. And I think, it still ended up being a little, I don't know. It felt kind of disappointing. Another team that also fired their coach. But unlike Cleveland, right, the Lakers, are kind of branding themselves as a contender. So that's a lot different than the Cavs. You have LeBron and AD, who, again, those are some bright spots because they both had very good seasons. They were both all NBA guys. But then after that, I don't know, like D'Lo regular season, Had a good regular season. Postseason, I guess he was one round, 5 games. I guess he was better against the Nuggets this time around than last time around, but he also had a pivotal game where he had 0 points. So that wasn't necessarily good either. You had some you had some rough stretches where guys were out. Like Vanderbilt didn't really play at all. Gabe Vincent literally didn't play at all, right? I think he probably um, played more games than he made shots, right? Which, I don't know about that. So that was kind of disappointing. So I don't know. Not a whole lot of bright spots here. You know what I mean? And I think like it kind of feels like this is probably a team that's probably going to have to make some changes. Right? Maybe probably that backcourt, right? We'll see what happens. Maybe some other guys along the roster. They already made a change in terms of the coach, which we'll get into momentarily. But yeah, and again, it's my team, so maybe I'm probably just going to be more harsh than maybe another team. But hey, if I'm going to give some of those other teams Fs, I got to give them an F as well.
Yeah, F for Fakers. I thought that this team was going to be a 3 seed, at least top 3 seed, going into this season. And yeah, boy, oh boy, was I wrong. This team was not it. The coaching was subpar, I think. And, you look at Darvin Ham and, he's gone as well. So, when you fire your coach, I think that's, indicative that there were some very big issues going on. Like you said, Braun and AD, I don't really have a problem with their season. I think it's just the supporting cast. They didn't really show up. The roster definitely was not optimized to those two guys' needs. You could clearly see that. So big fat F for the front office. But, I think the stars like LeBron and AD, they can kind of skirt away without taking a whole lot of blame for, this season and the way that it transpired. Because I think, they played some good basketball this season. But, once you got to the playoffs, you kind of already knew it was wraps, bro, especially considering who your opponent was. So F for them. Yeah. This season amounted to a whole lot of nothing. This was a waste of a season.
Yes, absolutely.
So
next up, to round out, the first round teams, we got the New Orleans Pelicans. This one, I don't really know what to do with them in terms of a grade. It's a little weird because, they had a good regular season, right? They won 48 games. Which, was the most that they've had in a while, right? Because the one that made the postseason a couple seasons ago, I think they had a losing record. They just got in through the lower end of the play-in. But, I think there were some positives, right? Zion started the year off slow, but I think he finished really strong. I think you felt good about him in that play-in game. But, at the same time, I think the tough part is that, your two stars still weren't really there when you needed them, right? Zion ended up getting hurt in the postseason game. Ingram came back, right? But he didn't seem like he was the same post-injury. Now he's in a bunch of trade rumors, so that obviously is not a great sign. I think some of the other members of the supporting cast I think you liked. I think Herb Jones shot really well from 3, had a really good year. Trey Murphy seems like he's probably poised to take the starting spot, from Ingram, assuming they move on from him. Valanciunas probably isn't coming back. Don't know what really happens with CJ McCollum. I'm assuming he stays. So I'm kind of in the middle. So I might say like C+, B-, somewhere around that range. Because I think, again, they made the playoffs, which they hadn't done in a little bit other than, 2 seasons ago when they weren't that great. And there were some things to like. But at the same time, it still feels like there's probably some more changes needed. So I would probably say C+.
I give them a B. I think I liked what I saw from them. At times, it was just the health was a big factor, but I think the potential is there for sure. And having a guy like Zion on your team is awesome. And I think he proved that towards the latter end of the season, and obviously the play-in as well. So that's kind of where I stand on them, but that might be being a little bit too lenient. So probably like C+, B-, that kind of range.
Yeah, and and that's my point where I'm like, this is one of those teams where it's like I don't, I'm kind of in the middle because, like I said, I like some, but not all.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's like it's kind of tough because it's another one of those teams where it's like the way that it ended, almost kind of masks like how good it was for most of the year, or at least the latter part of the year. And that's kind of where we are with that one.
Yeah.
So that's it for the playoff teams. So now we get into the play-in teams, I guess, the other play-in teams, right? So the lower bracket. Start in the East. Start with the Hawks, or excuse me, the Bulls. So that one I'm gonna probably say D.
Oh, wow. Okay.
There
That's
were some
interesting.
things I liked. I liked Kobe White. Liked Ayo Dosunmu. DeMar DeRozan had another good year. Russo had another good year. Um, but it's still another year where I don't really understand the point of this team
Hmm.
because I just again, what's the point of being in the 9-10 spot? Again, they didn't really do anything at the deadline. Already made some moves already, before we recorded, so we'll get into that. So maybe
Yeah.
that changes some things. But like I said, I do like some of the young players. Patrick Williams was hurt, and it feels like he's just been, I don't know, kind of hit or miss. For the most part in the league, right? He's had some good moments, but also moments where we just haven't literally seen him play. So I don't really know what, and also again, Lonzo Ball didn't play, so I don't really know what to make of this team. But I do like some of the pieces, but there's also a lot of pieces where I'm like, get him out of here. So like, if they had done some of that at the deadline, then I probably would have bumped the grade up, even if they made the play in. But I mean, they didn't really do anything, so it's like that's where it's kind of an underwhelming season. Again, C is probably acceptable if you want. And given what the expectations are, that's fine. But it's like, if you're a Bulls fan, like, did you really love a whole lot of what you saw this season? Like, probably not, other than maybe Kobe White.
Yeah, I'm gonna give them a B. This might be a
Okay.
little bit too lenient, but I'm kind of grading these other teams on a little bit of a different scale because I think
Mm-hmm.
we knew that playoffs were not their aspirations,
Right.
obviously.
Mm-hmm.
But for them to go 39 and 43 was not something I booked this season. I thought they were going to be a little
Yeah,
bit worse.
they were better
Um,
than we thought, for sure.
Exactly. That's kind of why I putting them at a B. And also, Kobe White, this was kind of his exhibition series, or not exhibition series, but exhibition season, I think, because,
Mm-hmm.
you like what you see from the guy. He was a lottery pick, but hadn't been really playing like one previously. And
Right.
now he's looking like, a top lottery pick. And that's what I think, Chicago Bulls
Mm-hmm.
fans want. Now that gives you a roadmap, now you can really explore, trading, Levine and just
Mm-hmm.
revamping the roster just a little bit, or
Right.
either committing to a full-on rebuild built around Kobe White for a couple of years, something like that. I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
but I think
And that's fair.
you do walk away as a Bulls fan, I think, feeling a little bit more confident in the fact that Kobe White was a hit, not a miss.
Yeah. And I guess again, if you're gonna give him a higher grade, I think the Kobe White factor, is important. And like
Yeah,
you said, they were better than what we thought. It's just again like, if I'm the Bulls, I would have preferred to have been worse, just so I
yeah,
could get like a higher pick.
fair.
Obviously, I know this isn't the same type of draft, where a higher pick means a whole lot. It's just it would have been nice. But,
Yeah.
at the same time, it's understandable. Um Hawks. Now this one. Yeah. Um, yeah, I'm giving them an F. Because this was a team, that made the playoffs last year. They played the Celtics actually, lost in I think what was it, 6? So that was respectable. But I think we also thought when they made that trade for DeJounte Murray, we thought they'd be better, right? Now, I mean, did we expect them to come out of the East? No, but a first round exit kind of felt like a disappointment.
Right.
Although you kind of look back and think like, all right, where's the room for them? In terms of moving, into the second round, right? Because you had, Boston, you had Philly, you had, the Heat were the lower seed, but also had the Bucks, although they went out in the first round. Um, and you had the Knicks, right? But either way, you kind of thought that the Hawks could find some way in there, but they didn't. And then they managed to do even worse this year, right? Like they weren't even a playoff team at all, right? They got bullied, embarrassed by the Chicago Bulls, who are also not a very good team. Obviously, I know they had some rough stretches, right? Trae Young missed a decent amount of time, but not a whole lot of positives. I mean, like Jalen Johnson, that's a positive, right? Because I think he showed a lot, this season, right? Where you can kind of view him as a building block going forward. A Kungwu, right? I guess is kind of in a similar boat where you feel good about him. Um, but outside of that, I don't know. Again, this team has a lot of questions, right? Because we know the backcourt doesn't work. What do they do with it? They have the number one pick. What do they do with it? They have some other players where it's like, what are they going to do with them, right? Capella, Bogdanovich, I don't know. Like, there's a lot of questions I have about this team. And most of the questions that were answered are questions that I don't think are really, excited questions. So, yeah, that's an F for me.
Yeah, FAWKS. That's pretty much what they are. I don't necessarily understand this team. We were marketed and promised an elite backcourt, an elite
Hmm.
team, and they have not shown us that at all. I feel bad if you're an Atlanta Hawks fan, but I
Hmm.
feel bad if you're any team, on this area of the grading list. Like, this is just not a good place I think you want to be in general.
Hmm.
And yeah, the Hawks don't really have a whole lot of bright spots because now you have a question about your backcourt. Where do you move on from? Now, what do you also do with that number one pick? Seems like they're not going to trade it, but just their regular
Hmm.
season, it was so bad. And last
Yeah.
year it was like, all right, they're just mid. Like, they might have a better season
Mhm.
next year. But like you
Yeah.
said, this year they completely backtracked, took 10 steps backwards somehow and ended up being a 10 seed. So yeah, not a great showing for them. And yeah, this roster needs a lot of construction, I think.
Yeah. Now moving on to the Western Conference play-in.
Sure.
So the Kings, Kings. I really want to give them an F. I might give them a D minus.
I'll give them an F.
Only, huh, you said what?
I'm giving them an F.
Yeah,
Spoiler.
only because I didn't really have them in the same tier as some of the other teams, but I also at the same time, the reason why I wouldn't give them any higher than a D minus is because this is at the very worst or supposed to be a regular season team, and they did not make the playoffs because they couldn't win enough games in the regular season. Despite having decent luck in terms of health. I know, the latter part of the season it went kind of sideways because Monk and Herter got hurt and Fox missed a little bit of time. But yeah, bright spots, Keon Ellis, right? That was cool, right? That he came in and was able to start and help them win a big playing game and some other games, during the latter part of the season, right? Keegan Murray was fine in year two, right? He had, that crazy game where he hit, double digit threes or whatever. So that's nice, right? Sabonis and Fox had really good years. Fox shot better from three. Sabonis had a really good year, but still kind of felt underwhelming, right? Because you're in the play-in, you were in that lower part of the play-in, and then you beat the mighty Warriors, right? But then you ended up losing to the Pelicans without Zion, so that
Yeah.
wasn't great. Even if they had made the playoffs, as the eighth seed, I still would have said like D minus, just because it's a downgrade from last year. Like they didn't do much better in the regular season. Actually, I think they did a little bit worse, not significantly worse, but because there were more good teams, obviously, they ended up falling. So yeah, I gave them a D minus. Like I said, there were some cool things. At least you re-signed Mike Brown, so that's nice. And now you re-sign Malik Monk, which is also great. But that's this off season, not this season. So D
Yeah.
minus.
F for them. To go from what was it, a third seed last
Yeah,
year?
three seed.
Yeah,
Yep.
to going down 6 notches and going down to number 9. Yeah, it's
Mhm.
hilarious actually, and I'll never forget it. Still sleeping on the Kings. Yeah, I'm
Yep.
taking a big siesta on them. They are just not competitive at all in terms of the way the West is looking. You look at the teams that finished above them. You look at the teams that are kind of on their tail and on their case.
Hmm.
I don't even think they're going to be better than a couple of teams behind them next year. So at the end of the day, you do have a lot of questions about them. But I think the core is solid. That's the only plus side. Like you
Yeah.
said, Sabonis and Fox, I love, but the rest of the guys and the cohesiveness, I'm like, I don't know, compared to the rest of the West. And
Hmm.
like you said, they're supposed to be a regular season team, and they couldn't even compete during that. So yeah, big time F.
Yeah. Warriors. Another F.
Yeah, yeah,
WTF is more like it.
yeah,
This was another team that I thought was going to be a contender. I know we were not quite as high, I think, on some of their stuff as maybe some other people, but I think we still respected them, where we thought that they would be, a contender, right? Because we had them in that tier, because we had the Nuggets in the top tier of the West. And then after that, I think, what did we do? We did like Lakers, Suns, Warriors,
mm-hmm,
um, some other team. I don't even remember at this point,
mm-hmm,
probably. Um, and yeah, they were not that. Now again, record wise, doesn't sound that bad, right? I think it was basically about the same as it was last year,
yeah,
right? I think they
46
won
and
what
36.
44 games last year, 46 this year, right? So
Yep.
obviously that's cool, but it's it was better, but the standings were worse because the West got better. there were some positive things, right? Their rookies played very well, right? Pajemski was really good. Trace Jackson Davis, which was a guy that we thought was going to be a first round pick. Don't know how he slipped that far towards the end of the draft, but he did, and he played very well, especially during the latter part of the season, right? Pretty much took over Kevon Looney's starting spot, and Looney might be off the team. We'll see. But so that was cool. Kuminga, he took a leap this year, right? He had a really productive season. But outside of that, didn't really love a whole lot else on the roster, right? I think, Draymond, that was very strange, right? A lot of missed games for no reason really, other than I don't even really understand why. Kind of pointless. Hurt your team, put yourself in a rough spot. Clay, right? Finished the season better, but I don't know, right? Like he's in a different spot, right? Like obviously. And then Steph honestly had a down year compared to what he normally did, mainly because in the second half of the season he just ran out of gas. Like he basically had nothing left. Obviously, the construction of the roster is part of it, but there's also real signs in terms of age for the core guys. Also, Wiggins was bad. Played better during the end of the regular season, but the bar was subterraneanly low. He was very awful during the beginning of the season.
Yes.
I don't know what happened. Maybe there's some personal stuff going in there, so I'm not ruling that out, but didn't make any sense. So, yeah, not a lot of positives. And this, also Chris Paul forgot he was on the team in the play-in game.
Sounds
not
about
great
right.
in the play-in game. But to be fair, I think in his minutes when he was out there, they were positive. But, defensively, it was still kind of weird, right? Because he was out there to close games. They were very puny. And you could see some of the negative impacts that had at different points. Just, again, I don't know. I understand that, it was financial flexibility. And Poole wasn't great in Washington. So obviously, but that was more of a financial thing, like I just said. But either way, not a lot of positives from this season. So, I mean, again, if you ask any Warriors fan, was this a successful season? I think most serious fans would probably tell you no.
Yeah, it's the end of an era. F for them. They're still dealing with the ramifications of that punch, which is kind of insane if you really think about it. But yeah, they didn't show up in, I think, a lot of ways that we kind of expected them to at times. And like you said, I think Draymond, it was just awkward. Clay is cooked. Wiggins didn't show up. Curry had a down year. It's just a whole lot of just everybody not really doing anything and doing their job, I think, in the way that they can, and we know that they can. Even Steve Kerr, very low on his coaching this year. My gosh, the lack of adjustments, the lack of knowing what his guys are capable of, I think, was hurt them a lot.
Got into a tussle with Kuminga. Well, he didn't really, lean into it, but
yeah, just not good, bro. Like everything that I think we heard from the Warriors this year was all bad, except for their young guys. I think I fell in love with Pods, fell in love with Trace Jackson Davis, but at the end of the day, I mean, what do you want me to say? I mean, like it's an F. It's an F. I don't know. I don't know if there's a way they can bounce back either. That's another reason why I'm putting them at an F as well.
Yeah. And now we have the non-playoff teams, right? So, now we're in the bottom, tier of the group, right? So we'll start with the Brooklyn Nets. Yeah. I'm going to give them an F. I did not really love anything from this season. I think there were some cool things. Like, I think, Cam Thomas had a good year, I think. Again, I think he showed some positive growth as a passer playmaker. So that's cool. Mikal Bridges felt like he had, kind of a down-ish year, and I think it's more so just kind of like, realization, from some people that he's probably not good enough to be like the number one on a team, right? And that, if you're Brooklyn, you either need to kind of decide whether or not you want him as another piece building block, or do you trade him and kind of get some value back, right, before that value goes away. Claxton, right? Okay, fine. They're going to pay him, right? He's a good defensive big, so that's cool. Right, Cam Johnson feels like now that contract might be a little bit too much for what he does, and he's not a bad player at all, but, it feels kind of weird. And then what else did they do at the deadline, right? They traded Spencer Dinwiddie for Dennis Schroeder, so that's cool. Day'Ron Sharpe, that's cool. Lonnie Walker... played earlier in the season and then was basically banished. I know he had an injury, but I guess he just kind of fell out of favor. Um, so I don't know. Like I said, I know I mentioned some things, but not a whole lot of bright spots. I don't think there was a whole lot of minutes from like the guys they drafted. Like I don't think Clowney played a ton until maybe like towards the end, if I'm not mistaken. And I don't think Whitehead played at all because he was hurt. So couldn't even really talk a whole lot about the rookies. But I mean, what are the bright spots for Brooklyn? I mean, I guess I kind of mentioned them, but kind of hard to really think about it. And also, they fired their coach.
F.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. That's the end. The end. Like there's really nothing to say about this team. I think in terms of positivity, you look at the record they finished with 32-50. That sucks. You also had the whole Ben Simmons debacle that didn't work out in your favor, and I think people were kind of holding out hope that he could actually be a playable guy. Yeah, wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And then Mikal Bridges, like you said, took a step back. I think Cam Thomas showed up a little bit, got injured, and then I don't know. I don't know. They're a tough team to gauge. I don't know how to feel about them. I don't know what their sense of direction is. They said that they're not trading Mikal Bridges, so that's nice, cool, okay. But it's like, is that going to be a championship kind of guy? I don't know. I don't think so, personally. But who knows what they do? I don't know. It's such an awkward thing. But they're still reeling from the, breakup of the big three. So I get it. It's a tough situation to be in when, every single guy on your team force their way out. And this is kind of what you're left with. So I get it 100%. But at the end of the day, you have to live with the mistakes that you built with. So.
Yeah. After that, the Toronto Raptors. This one is kind of strange because, I don't feel like this was like a DF, scenario. I mean, this was not great. I mean, I might say D plus, right? Maybe. Only because, if anything, I did like what they got back for OG Anunoby, and it's not that you would always you're gonna consider those guys as building blocks, but just you got back something.
Yeah.
Right? Because for a long time it was like, oh, you're gonna need a bunch of picks and players to get Anunoby, which I just don't think anybody realistically believed. But you got something back, right? You got RJ Barrett. He had some personal stuff going on, obviously, so he, didn't play a ton, but he seemed good in the minutes he played. Quickly, right? They're gonna pay him, obviously, so that's gonna be kind of an expensive thing. But he was fine, right, in terms of what he was supposed to do. Scotty Barnes got hurt. Before he got hurt, he was an all-star, right? So, the three-point shot fell from where it was, right? I think he finished the season at 34%. So, I think that needs to get up. And then obviously, Jakob Poeltl, played and then got hurt. Before he went down, it felt like when they first made that OG trade that they were actually kind of trending up. But then they actually realized, hold on a second, we need that pick. So let's lose. And they lost and lost and lost and lost. And then they didn't even get the pick. So if they had gotten the pick, I actually probably would have bumped it up. But obviously, I understand that this isn't an amazing draft necessarily, so it's not quite the same as what you would normally.
Right.
So it's, losing a pick in this year's draft isn't the same as what it would normally be, but it's still a pick, right? And then what else do they do? Re-sign Kelly Olynyk or trade for and give Kelly Olynyk an extension? Cool, that's cool, right? Grady Dick, they drafted him, didn't really do a whole lot early on. Did more later on. They also traded for Spencer Dinwiddie and then cut him. So I guess that's interesting. But, like I said, I went back and forth, but I'm probably just going to land on a D plus. But like I said, there were some things that I liked, but losing the pick does hurt. Again, it's not like a typical, thing where you lose a pick, in this year's draft, but it's still rough. I think they would have liked to have had that pick. If anything, maybe to even trade back or something like that.
Yeah, I'll give them a D. I think, they started the rebuild somewhat. You moved on from Siakam. You moved on from OG. Yeah. Now you have Scotty. He's the face of your franchise.
And I didn't love the Siakam return because I just didn't like that they only got picks.
Sure, agreed. But my thing is, at least they moved on from him. A lot of teams are still clinging to what's left of their old regimes and old teams. And it's like, no, just move on, buddy. And that's what Toronto did. You know, they got decent return for OG. So, you know, they did what they had to do and did what they should have done. Kickstarted the rebuild. Good job. But at the end of the day, now you're not a competitive team. So D.
Yeah. And then next up, Hornets. So
Can we just group these bottom three teams into one?
okay, all right. So Hornets, Wizards, Pistons. We're just gonna give them Fs.
Please.
All right, we're just gonna give them Fs.
What can we really say? Like, Charlotte has no bright spot except for Brandon Miller is awesome.
Yeah,
Mellow,
that
but
was
he's
a great
always
pick.
hurt. Yeah, Brandon Miller, phenomenal pick. You know, like you said, but no, like you're not gonna be winning. You didn't win this season, even with Brandon Miller. The team's roster construction is bad. Same thing with the Wizards. You're rebuilding. Detroit, you can touch on that if you want, but I don't. They're an F. All these are Fs.
Yeah, I mean, for the Hornets, you know, we like Brandon Miller. That was a really good draft pick. I do like the fact that they did a decent job of, like, at the deadline, moving on from pieces that they didn't really need anymore. Like, you got rid of Rozier, but I mean, what did they get back? Like a future first that's not going to mean anything because it's Miami, and then Lowry, who they couldn't move anyway, so they just had to cut him.
Yep.
What was it? Washington, right? You got back Grant Williams. Okay, cool. So that's nice, and you were able to move off of Gordon Hayward, and you got back Trey Mann. So that's cool, right? Who was the other guy they got back? Polkashevsky, or did they just sign him?
I think they just signed him.
Okay.
Because I think Pokachev, whatever his name is, he got cut.
Yeah, but anyways, either way, so I like that. I like the trades they made at the deadline. I like the Brandon Miller draft pick. But nothing else really went right. LaMelo's struggled to start the season, closed the season really well, but the problem is that he closed the season in like October, November. So that's not great.
Yeah.
So
bad, bro.
didn't really love that. You know, obviously they made some big changes this offseason, right at the end of the season, right? Like, you know, obviously this is the first year where like Jordan's not going to be owning, you know, the majority owner. They brought in a new coach. But I don't know. And then, you know, in the draft, we'll see what they do. But obviously this was this season. So yeah, not great. Detroit, you lost 30 games in a row at one point. Don't really know how that really could be anything other than an F.
Mm-hmm.
If you set new records for failure, yeah, I don't think I can really give you that high of a grade. We liked their offseason. We thought they'd be better. They somehow took a step back. Don't really know how that happened. Asor Thompson, cool draft pick. Monty Williams, cool hiring. Now he's gone. We'll talk about that momentarily. But yeah, not a lot to love there. And then the Wizards, that's your team. Obviously, they traded Bradley Beal, or Brad Beal as you call him, right? They did that. Didn't get a whole lot back. I guess what was it? Chris Paul and some pick swaps. Then they traded Chris Paul for Jordan Poole. We liked that. Didn't really pan out amazing, you know. But at the same time, you know, as you said, he played better towards the end of the season. They found a coach, I guess, that they liked. They traded for Marvin Bagley, so that's nice. But
all to lose games, F.
Yeah, but you know, at least they ended it with a top pick, right? They got the number 2 pick. You know, Detroit got the 5th pick. Again, this is not the year where you're going to complain too much about getting a lower pick. But you know, if you're Detroit, it would have been nice to lose 30 games in a row and at least be rewarded with one of the top picks. But again, it's not like it was last year. If this had happened last year and they dropped to 5, which I guess is kind of what happened, but it wasn't as bad, then yeah. But the fact that Detroit had to make some big changes in the front office already lets you know this was not how they expected this year to go.
100%.
So, then after that, you know, we're in the West again, right? So now we're at the bottom feeder West teams. Rockets, probably the only team of these bottom West teams where I'll actually give them a good grade. I'm gonna give them a B plus. You know, if you want, you know, you could give them an A if you want, but I'm gonna say B plus. You know, I liked, you know, what we saw. We saw early in the season they played really well. They were a playoff team early in the season. Then they kind of, you know, leveled out to what you probably expected. Then Şengün gets hurt. Then they have a crazy win streak without him. even though, yeah, they did play a lot of mediocre teams, but they were losing to a lot of those teams at one point during the season. And if it was the previous Rockets teams the last couple of years, they would have lost all of them. That would have been a losing streak.
Yeah.
So there was a lot to like. The signings of Van Vliet and Dylan Brooks were good, helped the team, added some more professionalism to the team. Jalen Green, had his struggles early in the year, closed the year out very well. You got some productive seasons, I think, out of other young guys: Şengün, Jabari Smith, Thompson, Tari Eason, Cam Whitmore, right? So they had a pretty good draft. Had an offseason that I think is better than some people give them credit for. And their regular season, they finished basically a 500 team, which, again, is pretty respectable considering where they were before when they were one of the worst teams in the NBA. So I think that's a positive. So that's cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'd give them a B as well. They finished 41-41. They were chasing the Warriors, but, eventually they kind of just pooped out. But, I think there's a lot to like. There's a lot of potential with the roster. They're still young. Udoka's a great coach. You can see that they're kind of formulating their identity. You're just a couple pieces away, I think, from not necessarily being a contender, but being a playoff team, which is awesome because that's a very fast turnaround considering where you were, a couple seasons ago.
Yeah. Then after that, Utah. I mean, I don't really know how to feel about this team. I mean,
Right.
I kind of want to give them a D.
Right.
And I think I'm probably going to stick with that. There were some positives, right? Marketing was once again good. Keontae George had a solid rookie year. Taylor Hendricks didn't play early on in the season and then played later and was fine. But after that, I don't really know. I don't know what happened to Walker Kessler. I mean, he was kind of up and down after being really good as a rookie. Maybe the roster changes is what happened. I don't know. Mike Conley not being there, maybe that's a difference, right? It's a lot different than playing next to, Colin Sexton. Which again, and Sexton had a fine season. So, there were some players that individually were fine. John Collins was weird. He shot the ball well. But it still sounds like he might still be in trade rumors. So, given that they didn't really give up anything to get him, I don't know how good that really feels, but I don't think he's a bad player. But I don't know. Like, I don't really know what they were doing this season. And it felt like some guys had good years and some guys had some so-so years. So that's kind of a mixed bag. I mean, I guess I didn't really expect them to be better. But they, had a positive year last year considering, what happened. But this feels kind of like a little bit of a step back. And like I said, I just don't know what the direction is. So D for direction, but directionless. But I'm sure they'll probably figure it out at some point in the draft or the offseason, and then things will be a little bit clearer.
I give them an F. This team really stunk. 31-51. That's no record to be proud of, in my opinion. Like you said, you had some okay pieces, but at the end of the day, clearly wasn't built to, contend. Clearly wasn't built to win games, or else they would have done that. And yeah, F for them.
Yeah. After that, Memphis Grizzlies. So what do we do with this group? Because they were bad.
Mm-hmm.
They were 27-55, right? Considering they were a playoff team last year, right? They were the 2 seed. So they were bad. But they also had one of the most injured, if not the most injured season in NBA history. So, you have to factor that in there. I guess there were some positives, right? Like, a couple of their young guys, I guess, were kind of standouts, right? Because, like, G.G. Jackson, had a good rookie year. So that's nice. There were, like, a bunch of random, like, 10-day two-way guys that had decent stretches. What was it, like Scottie Pippen Jr., Tyler Jemison, right? Like, just guys that I don't even know if they'll actually be on the team next season. They traded Steven Adams to Houston. They traded Xavier Tillman to Boston, so that's cool, I guess. But after that, I'm probably still going to give him an F or an F because, I mean, given what happened last year and then you go into this season, that's a big letdown. I mean, at the same time, I understand that the injuries were a big factor, but like, I guess the only positive is I guess you gave some, you got some good production out of some rookies, so maybe they'll be rotational guys next year, but I don't know. This was like the year from what, I think, for them.
Yeah, Memphis deserves an F here. I think, the injuries are for sure a reason why. The main
Yeah,
reason why, absolutely.
yeah,
But then, the off the court stuff with Ja and then him getting injured as well. It's just ridiculous. You got Marcus Smart. Guess what happened
yeah.
to him? Injured. So, your return pieces were injured as well. So, like you said,
Mhm,
Gigi Jackson looks awesome. I think, he'll be a good piece to have around, but at the end of the day,
mhm.
it's not a game changing like rookie, you know? He doesn't
Right.
make me
He
like
doesn't play if they're healthy, probably.
that's what I'm saying. Well, maybe. I mean, I'm not gonna say that. I feel like he's in like the rotation for sure. Maybe like,
Hmm.
you know,
He probably
eighth.
wouldn't have gotten as many opportunities, though.
Yeah,
I
I
don't
feel like
think.
he's like the eighth man in the rotation if they're
Hmm.
healthy. Which is cool to have because I think he's a good guy, but at the end of the day,
Hmm.
27-55 injury riddled spells F for me.
Yeah. Spurs, another team where I don't really know what grade I really want to give him. Obviously, you got Wemby, so
Yeah.
that's awesome. He
Yeah.
had a great rookie year.
Yeah.
But outside of that, I don't think I really liked anything else from this team, if I'm going to be honest. Um,
Agreed.
I don't know why Jeremy Sohan played point guard, right? I mean, I guess maybe that might help with his ball handling and decision making next season. So, I'll eat crow, if that happens. And it might happen. So that's
Yeah.
fair. Yeah, that was weird. I don't know why they didn't start a point guard for most of the season. And, funny enough, I guess that can't be a coincidence that Wemby all of a sudden started playing even better than he was playing earlier in the year. So I don't know if there's a correlation there, but there might have been. Um, but yeah, other than Wemby, I didn't really like anything else. I mean, they got 2 lottery picks out
Yeah.
of this season, so that's cool. But, you know, F, D minus. I mean, I
Mm,
don't really, I don't know. Like, I mean, maybe somebody might be willing to give him a C, but like, and I expected them to be bad, but just what I saw, I just didn't really love most of it up until everybody literally was hurt, and then it was just like play through Wemby, get out of his way, let him work. Outside of that, like I didn't really like anything else, so I'm gonna give him a D. If maybe D minus because I didn't really like a whole lot, and I don't really know how many. You know, I guess Devin Vassell was fine, but outside of that, I guess Trey Jones cool, but I don't know. There's a lot of questions I would have about this team.
I give him a D.
Yeah.
I
D.
think I like Wemby. I like Vassell. I like Trey
Hmm.
Jones. That's about it.
Hmm.
Pop, cool. But, at the end of the day, they didn't win games. That wasn't their goal. But at least you hit on Wemby, as you should have. He's the number one pick for a reason. So
Hmm.
you did that. And, your job was to lose games so you can, get a lot of picks and stuff like that and just be bad
Hmm.
and rebuild. So boom, you got
Yeah.
Wemby, you got your 2 lottery picks. D.
Yeah. Um, Blazers is the final team. Another team
Yeah.
that I'm not sure what I saw.
Hmm.
Um, they drafted Scoot, so that's cool. Didn't really have a great rookie season. Got better towards the end of it, but started off really rough, right? Shot
Yep.
38.5 from the field,
Hmm.
32 from three. A
Hmm.
lot of turnovers, a lot of
Hmm.
fouls, a lot of funny plays. But again, he got better. DeAndre Ayton, who they traded for, um, yeah, wasn't really that great this year. He closed the year off really well, so maybe that makes you feel good about it. Simon's cool. Brogdon, please trade him at some point. Jeremy Grant, please trade him at some point. Some of these guys, I don't really know why they didn't move them at the deadline. I understand with Grant his contract. I feel like Brogdon was movable. Robert Williams, didn't even really play for most of the year, right? He had knee surgery. Um, so not cool with that. But they, like you said about the Spurs, they lost a lot of games. And they wanted to get that pick, and they got 2 lottery picks, so that's cool. But I don't know. Because Scoot didn't have a great season, it didn't feel like a season where you feel a lot of positives. I think he will be better in year 2, but it's probably like a F for me because
Yeah.
there's just not a whole lot I liked. I mean, like I said, I think they were supposed to be bad. I mean, and I wasn't super high on them. I know there were other people that were higher on them than me, But, just watching that team at different points of the season, like, it was just bad. It was not a fun team to watch for most of the year, which should not have been the case. I know there were injuries, but they should have been at least somewhat entertaining to watch. And they
Yeah,
were not.
big time F for them. I think
Mm-hmm.
they have the pieces to be successful. Some of them,
Mm-hmm.
at least. It's
Mm-hmm.
just unfortunate that the one that you were kind of banking on being awesome was not awesome this season. In
Mm-hmm.
Scoot, that is. And, he's young, obviously. It's his rookie season. He's got a lot of time, but it's not a good look for his first season. So I think that contributes
Mm-hmm.
a lot to the reason why they're getting an F here. Now, obviously, the other pieces that they acquired stunk or didn't play.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, kind of another situation like Memphis where your acquisitions, good acquisitions, just didn't really see enough from them. F.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. Just to be the worst in the West, I think, is just automatic F.
Yeah. Well, that's pretty much, that's our grades, for those teams. So,
Yeah.
let us know in the comments, your thoughts on, whether or not you agree or disagree. Obviously, again, pretty long, but I think it was well worth it. So now we go into news rumors. We actually had multiple things happen today, hours, I guess, before we recorded. So the first one, JJ Redick, right? Officially hired by the Lakers, 4-year deal, about $8 million a year. Crazy story to follow. I mean, there were a lot of moments where I think we thought we knew what was going on, but we really didn't. I still don't really understand half of it. I don't know where the heck the Dan Hurley thing came from. It came out of nowhere, and we thought it was going to happen, and then it didn't. And then Shams basically was saying that it was never happening. It was almost like a Hail Mary. Um, Basically said like Woj's reporting was trash, which is kind of funny.
Yeah.
It's kind of, I guess, like the Kendrick Lamar Drake beef, right, going on right now.
Yeah.
So kind of a funny thing. But early on we thought it was Redick. It seemed
Right.
like it was going to be Redick, and then it wasn't, and then it was, and then it wasn't, and then it was. I feel like there's just a lot of people just reporting kind of strange stuff. It's kind of funny because there was one guy who was covering this whole situation. Of Lakers Daily, and it was this guy Anthony Irwin, and he was, for most of the time he was saying that JJ Redick was the guy. And then at different points there were a lot of people that were literally just clowning him, just dogging him, trashing him, for saying that his report was fraudulent when, like the Hurley stuff came out. And then after the Hurley stuff was done, then it was like Redick's cooled. But he ended up being right. So there are a lot of people that are gonna have to apologize to him, for, basically saying that his reporting was fake because he ended up being right. And Shams ended up being right? Because, there were some other people that were kind of saying that, Shams wasn't on his game at that point. But, he earned it this time. But more importantly, focusing on the actual hire, right? Obviously, there's some other stuff going on here, right? They mentioned him having a long call with AD, right? Because, there was an interesting rumor that kind of suggested that some players may not have wanted him on the team. And I think, in terms of guys that would have any serious level of input, I think we could pretty much figure that out, who that might be. But I guess it's also like the factor of like, we know going forward that AD is going to be the focus of the team. So it makes sense to talk to him, obviously, kind of, just see where he's at and let him know, like, hey, you're our guy. This is how I'm going to, build around or, run things through you or whatever. But, obviously, again, just kind of a funny story. But now he's the Lakers head coach, so goes from player, right, to media guy, podcaster to head coach, right? And this is, I think, the part where it gets kind of, intriguing because obviously he doesn't have any prior head coaching experience, and there's not a very good track record for guys that go into the NBA to coach that don't have that have no coaching experience, right? You've already mentioned Steve Kerr, right, who's a success story. But there are also other guys, right, that were not great success stories, right? Like Steve Nash started off fine, then kind of fell off. And there were others as well, right? Like Derek Fisher was one, right? Which, maybe some people have forgotten by this point, but that didn't really work out. Mark Jackson, funny enough, which I didn't even know, actually just went into coaching and didn't have any prior experience. I did not know that. Because I was watching or listening to a podcast. It was, the Bill Simmons podcast where he was listing out guys that went into coaching that didn't have a lot of that had no experience. So I did not know that, and there were others as well. A lot of them former players. But, that's the concern with this one, right? Because it could work, right? Because we know he's a very knowledgeable guy about the game, especially in terms of, modern basketball. And Shams' article kind of talked about, his ideas in regards to playing more through AD, especially late in games. Letting LeBron play off the ball more. I feel like I've heard this like 100 times over the last 6-7 years.
Right.
So, we'll see if they actually stick with it. But, again, that, like I said, some positives are he's a bright guy, but at the same time, it's still a lot different than being a head coach. So, again, I'm hopeful that it works out, but there's also not, a very good track record of stuff like this working out. But I also would say the roster to me is a little bit more important, in terms of like what do they do with that more so than the coach. Not that the coach isn't important, and obviously who the coach is kind of in a way sort of dictates what the roster might kind of look like. Because the GM and the coach in theory would kind of be, like, hey, these are the type of guys I like to coach. Try to get me some of these type of guys. But we'll have to see how this works out. Just because, again, there's potential for this to work out, but then there's also potential for it to not work out great, and then he gets fired, and then it doesn't really matter. We'll see. But they have a lot of work to do beyond the coaching this season, anyways. But it's funny because initially we thought it was going to be Redick, then we didn't, and now we do. So
Yeah, and it's funny, some other notable names, like you talked about, Mark Jackson. I think it was Doc Rivers with the Orlando Magic, Jason Kidd as well with the Nets, Larry Bird with the Pacers. So there are some success stories, like you said, but there's also some failures. I think it raises a lot of questions, specifically, is this more of like why is this guy a candidate in the first place, right? I think that's kind of like one thing that people are really honing in on, and a lot of people have talked about the LeBron podcast, all this stuff. Hey, I mean, it's a good podcast. You should go and watch it, but at the end of the day, does it offer us insight into what type of coach he's going to be? Not at all, because this is going to be his first time. We don't know what he's going to look like, and that's the danger. But that's also kind of like the beauty in it as well, because it could work out, immensely in the Lakers' favor. But yeah, I think they're handling it in the smartest way that they possibly can. Even though you fumbled with Hurley, we already talked about that. In one of our live streams, they're just like, yeah, the Hurley thing was just not it. In terms of lowballing him and stuff like that. But, you do have an opportunity here, I think, to build a roster that can contend. And also, what is this coaching staff going to look like with Redick as well? That's another concern I have.
Yeah,
it's like,
it was reported from Shams, the idea of some of the possible guys, that could be added to that staff. So they named names like Sam Cassell, right, who's obviously an assistant lead. Well, he's not a lead assistant. He's one of the assistants for the Celtics. My guess is that if he leaves to go to LA, he'd be the lead assistant, because otherwise you might as well just stay in Boston. They mentioned Jared Dudley, right, who's another guy who's, currently an assistant coach, right, for the Mavs, right? And then after that, there was also Scott Brooks, right, former Wizards coach, former OKC coach, right, kind of interesting. I don't know if that's actually what's going to, but that was a name that was put out there. Also, Rondo, right, Rajon Rondo, right, former Laker, actually, which is kind of funny. So, it's, I don't know, kind of a interesting mix of names. Again, it would be nice if there was somebody that had some prior head coaching experience. I know Scott Brooks is one, but I feel like maybe there might be somebody that might be a little bit better. And I'm not even saying he's a horrible coach or anything, because I know he coached OKC, but I don't know. I would also need to see. I would like to see who they put around him, because I feel like if you put some guys with more experience around him, that could probably help the transition. Doesn't necessarily mean it'll all work out in year one, because that's a very tall task, I think. But it would at least probably make the transition a little bit smoother. Because a couple of those guys, like Rondo has never coached. Obviously, he's, he was a point guard and a good one at that, obviously. But that's not a guy that has prior head coaching experience. Unless you say he actually, did do some coaching with the teams, because I know, they mentioned that he kind of coached he and LeBron kind of handled the offense for the Laker team during the title year. But, there's still some questions, because like you said, what was the process going into this hire, right? Because we don't really know what the process was, right? Like we know some names that were mentioned, but it doesn't really sound like, it sounded like Reddick was the main guy. And there's
Right.
just so many different stories, even other stories about, like, I think it was, because we already mentioned it, right? Like that some players may not have been in love with the hire. Again, I don't know what's true and what's not, because these are all things that were reported by different people. Even I think one thing that had come out that said like Linda Rambis was kind of against the Reddick hiring, possibly because of lack of experience. But I also like, why does she have really input on who the coach is anyways?
Right.
But I don't know. It almost feels like it kind of highlights like just some of the, I don't know, dysfunction in that group. I mean, at least they settled on a coach that I guess they liked. But, they did that 2 years ago and it seemed cool at first. And then it completely went, haywire. And now he's gone. And now you kind of almost understand why it's like, yeah, they've had a hard time kind of maintaining coaches, right? Because they basically had, 8 different coaches, in 12 years, right?
Yeah, and it's like
So,
I don't know. It, like you said, it just highlights the dysfunction. They do tend to overcorrect, but I think with the Ham firing,
mhm,
he needed to be gone in this case because he lost the
right,
locker room. My next question for JJ Redick is, can he command a locker room? I have
right.
no idea.
Yeah.
I'm sure he's a likable guy.
Mhm,
I think like you said, he has the IQ and all that stuff, but I need to see what he operates like, around a team, when he's
mhm,
the head of the team, because I don't want this to end up being, he's like LeBron's figurehead. You know what I mean?
mhm.
Where it's like
Sure.
LeBron is kind of operating behind the scenes and JJ's kind of just standing there. Like that's what I
Mhm,
don't want.
mhm,
And I don't think that's going to be the case, but I think you do have to kind of dig deep and look at this hire and question it, because it's
mhm,
like, has a player ever had like a podcast where his his head coach is his co-host? That's wild to me. If I was a
mhm,
Laker, I would be like, man, what is this? Like, is this a
mhm,
joke? Because I don't know if
mhm.
this, I don't know whether to take this hiring seriously or whether or not to laugh at it, if you want me to be honest. Just
Right, because
because I think there's so many factors that we don't
we
know.
don't know. And I think it's okay for us to say, I know we're, since we're doing this podcast thing, like, we should have all the answers, but we don't. We don't
Yeah,
have
we
the
don't.
answers to this one. We have no idea. I mean, I think he might be good, but I don't really know. Like,
Right.
that's the tough part where I don't really have a big frame of reference for this, because even the previous names that we mentioned, I mean, again, like most of them didn't work out. And like, some of the ones that did, there were some special circumstances, right? Like again, with Steve Kerr, he played for some great coaches and also was a GM guy, before he became a head coach. It wasn't like he just retired and then became a head coach. Um, Jason Kidd got better, right? But it took him time to get better, right? Like he wasn't considered like a great coach his first few years. He was out of a job for a little bit. He had to go back, he had to go down to being an assistant coach before he could go back up to being a head coach. So, that's the thing where it's like year one, I don't really expect it to be that amazing. But like I said, I think the roster is kind of a little bit more important, as of right now. I just feel like, because like if it's the same roster, but it's just JJ Redick instead of Darvin Ham, it's probably not really going to be that much different.
Exactly.
Maybe they might win more games because they'll, have a better starting five, but like result, it's probably not going to be a whole lot, a whole, it's probably not going to be that much different. We'll see though.
Yeah.
Um, Another quick, just a quick thing. Monty Williams got fired from Detroit, according to Woj, right? So obviously that kind of more so cements Detroit getting an F grade.
Mm-hmm.
I know you mentioned the Celtics all-time great team. Pistons might be an all-time worst team, not the worst team ever, in terms of talent, but just in terms of how this season went. Um, so yeah, we'll see who gets the job. Some people think it's James Borrego, and that Atkinson might be the guy that gets the Cavs job. They're currently gonna interview some assistants, right? I think they mentioned Micah Nori. They also mentioned Sean Sweetney, as well as JB Bickerstaff, right, who was recently fired from Cleveland. So, obviously they're gonna do their due diligence. I know a lot of people were saying, how did the Lakers not hire a head coach until 6 days before the draft? Well, there's a couple other teams that don't have head coaches either, but the difference is they fired theirs much later, right? The Lakers fired Darvin Ham only a few days after, losing in the first round. So that was basically like a month ago. Maybe more than that, I guess, at this point. Whereas, the Cleveland got, Bickerstaff was fired, like a few weeks ago, right? And then obviously Monty Williams was just fired today. So, or if you're watching this yesterday.
Yeah.
So,
it's an interesting
we'll see.
situation.
Obviously, he's going to take some time off, presumably. But yeah, not a great year for Monty. But he does get a lot of money out of this. So
yeah, I thought he was in the safe zone, if you want me to be honest. But, I think that kind of goes to show you that nobody's job is safe in the NBA right now. And now Detroit has to find a head coach, which is interesting.
And this is also a classic case of keep in mind, different front office guy. So once that happened, you knew that there was a chance that Williams could be gone.
Sure.
I know, there were probably some people who thought he might be safe. There was reporting that he might be safe. But you just never know when a new guy comes in, right? Obviously, with the Wizards, right? The Wizards brought in a new front office and they made some changes, right?
Yeah.
Changes that, the previous front office probably wouldn't have made.
Yeah, they moved Wes Unseld, who was the coach at the time, up to a different role in the front office, I believe, and then elevated Brian Keefe. Now he's the full-time head coach, which is, kind of what happens when a new regime comes in. So the writing was on the walls. I just thought since it was Monty Williams, a guy who had kind of been established a little bit, has a name and has shouldn't say reputation because his reputation is pretty bad at this point. But
I think it's kind of
I think it's soured. Yeah, it's really bad now. But I think he does have a name, so that's kind of why I thought he was in the safe zone. But now with this firing, I think his reputation gets even worse.
Yeah. After that, we had a trade today. A trade that I don't think we expected at all. So let's talk about it. We had the Chicago Bulls and Oklahoma City Thunder. You had Alex Caruso finally gets traded. But it wasn't to where we would have thought at all. It was Oklahoma City for Josh Giddey. So pretty wild, pretty unexpected. But I think for OKC, this is a very good trade because we talked about it. We said you knew that they were going to have to move on from Josh Giddey, right? Not a bad player, but didn't have a great season, and just clearly doesn't really fit, with OKC. His jump shot wasn't very good this year. And after that, when the shot's not falling, I know he can slash, I know he can pass and rebound, but in the playoffs, if you can't shoot, especially as a guard or a primary ball handler or secondary ball handler, you're going to have some problems. And then for Oklahoma City, you get a elite defender, right? He's been an all-NBA defender. And he, unlike, when he was with LA, right, he's become a much more consistent three-point shooter, right? As a Laker fan, I remember his game, and he's a better player now than what he was in LA. And he was good in LA, but he's even better. Especially now that, like I said, he's a much better three-point shooter, much more consistent. So he really fits in with what Oklahoma City, can do. He can do a little bit of playmaking, right? Like pick and roll, run some sets, right? But his role more so is like, spot up shooting, cutting and whatnot. You don't really want him on the ball quite as much, but that's also what SGA is for. It's what Jalen Williams is for. So he should fit in really well. You're going to have Lou Dort and Alex Caruso and Chet Holmgren and even Jalen Williams, and SGA are good defenders as well. So, they should be really good defensively, and they already were really good defensively. But obviously with Caruso, he's a much better fit, I think, than Josh Giddey. And then, from the Bulls' perspective, obviously you're, getting a look at a young guy, who didn't, pan out on the team he was on. But in Chicago, right, obviously, you get a look at him. And it sounds like more moves are on the way. And before we do that, I want you to give your thoughts on this trade.
I mean, first of all, when was the last time we've seen kind of like a 1-for-1 like this in a long time, right? Normally there's always a pick attached, another player, something crazy, But this is a pretty 1-for-1 trade, I think, If I were to grade it, I give OKC, A+. You move on from a guy who had some controversy, obviously. We're not going to talk about that, but if we're sticking on the court only, I think, it's a unique situation because I think he's a very good inside the arc scorer. It's just that doesn't really fit what OKC is trying to build over there. And to be able to move on from a guy like that is interesting. Now, the reporting on it was awkward because when I first read the the tweet,
Yeah.
it was like all-star potential. I was like, okay, I think Giddey can be good, but not all-star. I don't think. Not
Right.
not right now. And who knows?
All
That
he
could
is in
come
the
back.
East.
Yeah, and it's like, who knows? That could come back to bite me, but at the end of the day, I don't think he's going to be an all-star.
Right.
But you do like the things that he's been able to do, and he has kind of improved in certain areas that people have kind of been knocking him on, you know, for the 3-point percentage and stuff. I think he shot like 34% last year. So, you know, it's been trending upwards. Not great,
Right.
but, you know,
Yeah.
low volume as well. But I think I really do love the trade for OKC, like I said, because you were able to offload on a guy that you probably didn't have a whole lot of belief in, and you could clearly tell
Right.
throughout the postseason where his minutes and numbers dwindled to literally nothing.
Right.
And now you get Caruso, who fits your identity much better. You know, I think this is going to be awesome. We know that he's a hustle guy. He cares. I mean, like, I only know, I think, about 2 Chicago Bulls fans, and they were like, yeah, he was probably like the only guy who gave it like 100% every time he was out there. So shout out to Caruso, because I think he's an awesome player, awesome defender, and that adds to, you know, what Oklahoma City is trying to build. In Chicago, you get a promising young piece. I'm not going to say a promising all-star, potential all-star, like I think the tweet said when I read it. I was like, yeah, right. But I think it's a win-win for both sides.
Yeah. You know, and for Caruso, it sounds like they're gonna probably keep him long term and probably extend him. Right, he's got like a year left. Sounds like it might be 80 million, 4 years, something like that.
Right.
So, you know, kind of an interesting scenario, right? And it's again like I think that's an upgrade, you know, especially in terms of what you want, you know, from that other guard spot, right? Because again, like, you know, you could think about it this way, right? If you swap Josh Giddey and Caruso, right, like OKC probably does a little bit better. Right, obviously you know, the areas that they struggled the most with were a little bit different. But you know, just in terms of what he can do, I think that will help. And like you said, from Chicago's perspective, you get a look at a young player, right? You know, who, like I said, didn't pan out in the situation he was in. And you know, you get a chance. And obviously, OKC now you don't have to pay Josh Giddey. You pay Alex Caruso. You'd rather want to pay, and you didn't have to give up any picks. And they still have cap space because their contracts are about the same. I think Caruso makes a little bit more, like $1 million more, or something like that. So so OKC still will have like 30+ million in cap space. So there's going to be, you know, room for them to do even more, right? So obviously that's kind of the interesting thing for OKC, where if they have a really good offseason, right, then that's gonna put them in a really good spot. But going back to the Bulls, right, you know, looking at it from a Bulls perspective, sounds like they're actually going to be more committed to making some moves, right? Where it's probably not just going to be, you know, Alex Caruso, but others as well. They've mentioned Zach LaVine. They've mentioned Vucevic. The interesting part was there was Lonzo Ball, right? Because it kind of sounded like in the article that, you know, Giddey's looked at as Giddey's looked at as a Lonzo Ball replacement.
Yeah, I couldn't believe that.
Which is interesting. And there was another guy, you know, who I guess, you know, writes for the Bulls, Darnell Mayberry, and he was kind of suggesting the idea that Alonzo might get traded or bought out, which is interesting. So I don't know if that happens. It might, you know, I mean, if it does, that would kind of suggest that, you know, his rehab isn't going all that well. But at the same time, I guess you could also just say, like, they're just trying to get off the contract and get out of the situation. If he gets bought out, I'd be curious to see if any team, you know, like, you know, takes a chance on that. Again, I don't know what the chances of it are. But it sounds like the Bulls are going to have a pretty busy offseason, which is what they should have already done, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But, you know, I guess it's better late than never. And it makes sense because with the DeMar DeRozan sign and trade, when they grabbed him from the Spurs, they don't have, their pick is top 10 protected. So they need to bottom out this year, or else they won't get the pick.
Yes.
And next year's draft is supposed to be really, really good.
Well,
so,
one of a kind.
You know, yeah. So there's a big incentive for them to not be very good next season. So if they can kind of move on from a lot of those guys, like say let DeRozan walk, move on from LaVine, move Vucevic. If you can do all of that, then that's a good offseason. And that's going to put you in a good spot to rebuild, because none of those guys need to be there. Like they just don't. There's no point. Like what's the point? What's the point of DeMar DeRozan staying in Chicago? I mean, obviously the money, which, you know, is an important factor for pretty much every player, any serious person for the most part, right? Like, you know, the contract stuff is important. But if I'm the Bulls, why would I re-sign him? I would rather just let him walk. You know, let somebody else pay him.
Yeah, I would let him walk, trade LaVine, I would keep Lonzo though. I don't know about that one.
Okay.
That's an interesting one.
Hmm.
Considering how, although very biased, he's been putting out
Hmm.
clips of him dunking and stuff like that, so it looks like
Right.
he's on the path to recovery. Like I said, a little biased, but at the end of the day,
Right.
I don't know. That might just be me being like a Lonzo fanboy or something like that. But I
Hmm.
think at the end of the day, you do have to make some moves, and like you said, I'm glad they're starting now because it should have been done a long
Right.
time ago.
Yeah. Yeah. You might have a backcourt that might challenge Luca and Kyrie. Could be
Yeah,
Josh
right.
Giddey and Kobe White.
Yeah, right. But like with Oklahoma City too, it also kind of shows what their mindset is going to be going into this
Right.
offseason. Like it's a win now
Yep.
mindset, and it's like, yeah, we're going to be
Yeah.
making moves to go all in, build around this roster. We know Shea can compete with the guys in the West. We just need to buff
Yeah.
our roster up a little bit, and that's the
Right.
way they do it.
And that's what we said they should do. We said that they, should approach this offseason with the mindset of going all in, making some moves to improve the team. Don't just kind of let another year go by, because windows can close fast in the NBA, faster than you think. And, if OKC kind of just doesn't do anything, I think that would be a lost opportunity. So it's good to see that they're actually making some legitimate moves
Yeah,
that are going to improve the roster. And I don't think they're done because, again, they have a decent amount of cap space, so they could do more.
yeah.
Moving on, according to Kevin O'Connor, Brook Lopez could be on his way out of Milwaukee. It sounds like Milwaukee may want to play a different style, especially defensively, and Lopez may not fit there anymore. Right, so so there might be some teams that may have some, potential interest in him. Obviously, he's older at this point, right? So he's no longer quite the guy, that he once was. But he's still, he can still block shots. Obviously, he can still shoot. But just kind of an interesting, thing because obviously he was their starting center for a while. I don't really know where he goes. But again, if you're a team that needs some size, needs a big, you could do worse. Obviously, contract wise, makes a decent amount of money, but it's, very short term deal, right? I think he's got 1 year left on his deal, right? Didn't they give him like a 2 year deal?
Yeah.
So, obviously, we'll see. Kevin O'Connor, he mentioned, if you're Milwaukee, you could trade Brook Lopez for Bruce Brown, right? So you could bring in Bruce Brown if you're Milwaukee, and then Toronto could flip Brook Lopez somewhere else, right? Because we know that Toronto also wants to, they're going to exercise Brown's contract option and then probably look to trade him somewhere. So, we'll see, right? Because Bruce Brown, he did good in Brooklyn, he did good in Denver. Clearly, he can help out a good team, and that's probably a good signing if you're Milwaukee, or I guess good acquisition if you're Milwaukee. But what do you think of the Brook Lopez thing?
I mean, that's interesting. I think it's kind of smart to move on from him at this point just because of his age. You don't want to kind of gamble and like, hold on to him for too long to the point where he actually doesn't fit your identity. So I think this is kind of like a ahead of the curve kind of move, which is good. That's what they need to do, considering the way that their season ended. And I think adding a guy like Bruce Brown definitely helps you, I think, feel the holiday pain a little bit less.
Right.
But at the end of the day, does it make them a championship team? Probably not. But I feel
And
like,
who's the center?
yeah, that would be my next question. Is that also creates a big gaping hole in who your center is going to be? It can't be
Unless
Bobby
it's
Portis.
Giannis,
It can't be. I don't think it could. That puts a lot of stress on him, though. I think on the defensive end,
right?
more than you would probably want. As good as he is on the defensive end, and it can't be Portis. So it's like, I don't know. You'd have to like find another center, and I don't know who that would be.
Right. Yeah, and it can't be Thanasis, so
No,
I
no,
don't
no,
know.
no, no, no.
Um, Next up, according to Woj, right, Siakam. That was another guy. We didn't mention it in the team grading, but they signed him to or they're gonna sign him to an extension, right? Obviously, this is a new thing. Teams can negotiate with their own free agents after the finals, right, ended. And so it sounds like Siakam's going to get, a big max extension, right? 42 in the first year, 45 in the second year, 49 in the third year, 52 in the last year. No player option, right? So pretty much just 4 straight years. So it's a lot of money, but again, you traded for him, he played well. It's going to be interesting to see what they do with the rest of the roster, right? Because obviously now it becomes more expensive. Going to have to extend Nemhard at some point, and obviously Halliburton, right? His big extension will kick in next season. So, obviously big things are happening in Indiana. And it starts with that Siakam extension, right? Because again, you needed to re-sign him and bring him back. Don't even let him think about free agency because you can't let him go.
Yeah, I mean that's smart. You brought in you got him as an acquisition. You need to retain that. I mean, people really thought that he was going to walk. No, I think
No,
the assumption is that he's going to resign, extension, awesome, and I think it's a great move because I think he fits the Indiana system, and it gives you also a little bit of flexibility to bring in somebody else potentially, trade, draft, whatever the case may be. So I think it's a good system and a good fit to be in.
yeah. Eric Gordon, 50-50 on coming back to Phoenix, right? A reporter for the Phoenix Suns, or that covers the Phoenix Suns, said that. Jay Gambo on X. So does he come back? I mean, it's basically a minimum contract, right? So I mean, if he opts out, then that means he didn't really like his time there and goes elsewhere. But at the same time, it seems like with the new CBA, it may be a gamble if he opts out because what if nobody signs him? I
Yeah.
mean, and then he's kind of just stuck. So I guess if he's 50-50, that at least suggests. And we heard a story earlier in the year that he was kind of, I don't know, didn't seem like he was all that happy about his role there. So I don't know. I mean, he was kind of up and down for them. I think he started the year off fine, but it seemed like he didn't close it as well. I mean, he can still shoot. So, there's still a place for him on a rotation, but, he is getting up there in terms of age.
Yeah, I mean, I think he should resign. I think, that Suns team, they're not going to be bad in the regular season. I think it's just the playoffs that people have questions about.
Mm-hmm.
And I think he's a part of that question as well, because what can he give you in the playoffs? So I don't think he has a whole lot of leverage at this point. So I think he should just take whatever deals in front of him. Because if he doesn't get signed, then that's a big mistake, I think, on his part. So I would just go back, and continue to contribute in the role that you did, in the previous season, where it's you're there, you're knocking down threes, and you can be a good passer as well. So that's kind of how I feel about it.
Yeah. After that, Sixers interested in Kentavious Caldwell Pope, right? So obviously, according to Shams, it sounds like Philly is kind of out on Paul George, which is interesting. So that suggests, I mean, if there's no Paul George and presumably no Jimmy Butler trade, if I had to guess, then that kind of means they're going to have to default to the other option of, using that cap space to just sign a bunch of guys, right? So maybe it could be a guy like a KCP, right? It would be a good fit there. You'd have to give him a lot, right, to convince him to, move away from Denver. And Denver, ideally you can't really let him go. So we'll see if that turns into a bidding war. We know there's other players, right, that might sign, with Philly, right? Some of the guys that are already there, like Oubre and Kyle Lowry and others. But, what do you think? Because it's kind of interesting how it seemed like there were a lot of signs suggesting that he might go there. I think both you and I feel like he might return to the Clippers. I mean, that he probably will return to the Clippers. But, that stuff on TV last week, right, kind of was the first time where I'm like, oh, he might actually go to Philly. But I still think he ends up going back to the Clippers. But, we'll see. Because, again, I think the main question for Philly is, are you really going to want to give Paul George 4 years, $200-something million? And if the answer is no, then, I mean, what is the other option here? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not high on Paul George going to the Clipper or the 76ers, excuse me.
Right.
I think he returns. I'm not even high on KCP going to, the 76ers as well. I think he returns. I just don't think there's a lot of people that want to go to Philly for free agency, if you want me to be honest, unless they're thrown a crazy bag. And I don't know if Philly's going to be willing to throw out a crazy bag to a guy like Paul George, like you said, where he's not necessarily a bad player, but he's on a little bit of a decline, which you can definitely see in the postseason numbers. And the situation in Philly isn't much better than it is, with the 76ers. So it's the Clippers and 76ers, they're in a similar position where, yeah, you have decent regular seasons, but, your number one guy is barely available. So I don't know how I feel about it. I think Philly has the potential to hit on free agency and grab all the guys that they want, or whether it be a trade or something like that. But the question is, will they? It's all about potential. It's all up in the air.
Yeah. Now I will say, right, I think, and again, this could mean something, it may not mean anything. The wording of it, was that they're expected to be aggressive elsewhere with its salary cap flexibility and draft capital leading into next week's draft, right? Which is obviously before free agency. So that could suggest that, there may be some type of trade that they might pull off as opposed, and maybe there's a trade for somebody where maybe they're like, oh, well, now we don't want to sign Paul George. But, at the same time, you have to give up something if it's a trade. So I don't know. And that's where I'm saying, like, it could mean something. It might not mean anything. But just interesting because it seemed like he might go there. Like I said, I think both you and I thought he would just stay with the Clippers. But obviously, the Clippers can re-sign him can negotiate at any time. So we could easily get a report within the next couple of days that he re-signs, but we haven't so far. Harden as well.
Yeah.
After that, Gary Payton exercised his player option, right, of $9 million, according to Shams. This was interesting, right, because this was a guy that some people thought might opt out. But again, it's another situation where, if you opt out, are you going to get, more than $9-10 million from somewhere else? I don't know. I mean, again, he's a good player, right? He can help out a lot of teams. But I still feel like, if you put different guys in the tiers, there's going to be guys that are going to get paid before he does. So he probably just kind of gauged the market and probably was just like, yeah, it's probably just better to just opt in. And I think they can give him an extension, to keep him long term. But he is already 30, so he is getting up there, even though he's been productive for them.
I don't necessarily know how I feel about it in terms of Gary Payton. I don't know. He provides a lot, I think, but at the same time, what does he look like? Because he's been through a lot of injuries. I think he gives you a lot of athleticism, all this stuff that you kind of like. But even then, like, what does he really contribute a lot to a winning team? I don't know. I think you like the athleticism and the defense, but I don't know. It's an interesting situation to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Then after that, Klay Thompson's looking for 3 years, according to Shams. It sounds like the Warriors offered him 2, right? So again, it kind of just comes down to, again, can they agree, mutually on something? And if they do, he stays. And if they don't, he probably goes. Yeah. So I think both you and I feel like he ultimately finds a way to agree to something to stay with Golden State. But it is kind of a story, to just think about.
Yeah, he shouldn't be there, but he's gonna be. That's the interesting part. We've heard the rumors about Orlando. We've heard the rumors about even Philly. Yeah. I don't know. It's just like, I think the one that makes the most sense to me would be the Orlando one. That would be awesome. But him returning to Golden State makes, I think, a whole lot of sense in terms of, him retiring a Warrior, all that stuff. I think they clearly want him. It's just they want him in an affordable way. Okay. In a way that I think makes sense for both parties, where it's like, we're not, the bank isn't bleeding because you're here, but at the same time, we do want to do right by you. That's what I think is going on. It's just going to take a little bit of time to get the deal done from both sides, but I would prefer to see him go somewhere else, if you want me to be real.
Yeah, and then after that, Zachary Resacher, right? Apparently, there's a lot of buzz going on suggesting that he might actually end up being the number 1 pick and that it might be Alex Sarr that goes number 2, right? So obviously there's been a lot of movement in the Vegas odds. There's been a lot of buzz about teams, trading up, trading down for different picks, right? We know all of that. But it is interesting, right? Because there still hasn't been, like a clear cut, everybody agrees this guy is the number 1 pick. It seems like it's one of those 2 guys. It seems like it kind of changes which one is 1 or 2 every other day. But, do you think that, these teams are settling in and that Atlanta probably takes Resacher, or do you think that they end up kind of zagging and then end up taking Sarr?
I think they're going to take Resacher, if you want me to be honest. But that kind of throws a wrench into everything, because I think if they take Sarr, that I think opens up the door for these trade downs and trade ups and stuff like that. Because I think what would happen is, you've got a lot of clinging, teams that are high on Klingon. You've got a lot of teams that are high on Resacher as well. I don't think there's as many teams that are high on Sarr, if you want me to be real. Because what I would think would happen is if Atlanta takes Sarr, Risa Share goes number 2, but not to the Wizards. I think the Wizards would trade that pick
Yeah.
down to maybe like the Spurs for the 4th
Mhm.
and 8th pick, I think it is. So
Okay.
that's kind of what I would think would happen. But if Risa Share goes number 1, then I don't think there's going to be a lot of trading because I think the Wizards will
Okay.
pick Sar and then everybody else kind of falls down a notch. And I think everybody grabs who they want to grab.
Okay.
That's how I feel
Yeah.
about it.
Yeah. And again, like you said, it seems like the guy that there's a lot of, the non-Risa Sar guy that there's been a lot of buzz for is Klingit.
Yeah.
So like you said, if Risa Share goes number 1, then like you said, the Wizards probably do their thing, right? And then obviously if Risa Share goes 2, right, and Sar goes 1, like you said, well then it's like, well, the next team that wants Klingon will take him. And then after that, like you
Bless
said,
you.
it'll probably just be, whoever wants whomever, right? Because we know this is a draft with, again, there's not players that have like superstar ceilings that people expect, but there are players that I think a lot of teams would want, just as another guy, that can be a piece, for their team,
Yeah.
right? Like maybe none of these guys end up being all NBA players, but there could be a lot of guys that could end up being like good starters for teams.
For sure. Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. Also, according to The Athletic, the Pels shopping Brandon Ingram. They mentioned Rockets. They mentioned Philly, which is interesting. I saw a thing from Evan Sittery that also kind of was suggesting that the Kings are also looking at possibly either Brandon Ingram as well, or possibly Kyle Kuzma, right? So obviously each team has their own assets they can, move, right? Philly just has the cap space. I guess they have the picks they got from, Harden or whatever. And then obviously Rockets, right? They have the number 3 pick, right? So they could just be like, we'll give you the 3rd pick, we'll take Ingram, or I don't know, maybe that's not what they do. Maybe they attach something to. And then Sacramento, they're shopping the 13th pick with Kevin Huerter and Harrison Barnes, right? I think both you and I feel like Brandon Ingram, just because of all the noise, sounds like he's probably gone.
Yeah.
I guess the
100%.
main question is, where does he go? Because I think there's a lot of teams that would probably be like, yeah, we'd like Brandon Ingram if you guys don't want him. I guess I just don't necessarily know specifically which team, right? Like we've talked about Atlanta, we've talked about Houston. Well, I don't think Houston we've ever really talked about, but we've definitely talked about Philly, and we've definitely talked about Atlanta.
Yeah.
So Houston is kind of a new one.
Yeah, I would like Atlanta and
Sacramento.
Philly. Yeah, I'd like Atlanta and Philly. Maybe Sacramento too. It just depends on what Sacktown gives up.
Right.
But I really do like the Atlanta one the most. I think that kind of fits what they're potentially trying to build over there. Philly
Right.
would be interesting too because it does give you another creator. The only problem is he's so ball dominant alongside 2 other ball dominant guys. How well is that going to work out? And he's not known for his defense either. So I don't know. That would be my only question with the Philly one. So I guess if I were to rank them, probably be the highest on Atlanta, Sacramento, and then Philly.
Yeah. I guess with Sacramento, I feel like, their defense was actually better, this season than it was last season, but their offense took a step back. So you kind of wonder, like, what is their approach? Are they looking at more offense? Are they looking at more defense?
Right.
Maybe they just go, two-way guys, which are harder to get, I think, than just, one-dimensional guys.
Right.
So, but it definitely feels like Ingram is going to be out of there.
Oh,
I guess the question is, like, if you're Sacramento and you have the number 13 pick with Kevin Huerter and Harrison Barnes, what are you actually looking to get? Because, I mean, I guess if it's Harrison Barnes, you're presumably looking to get a wing, right? Unless you have Keegan Murray as your wing, and then you get a 4. But I don't really know if that's really what they're, trying to do. But I think if you get a forward, I think it needs to be a forward that can defend, like on the wing. Because I feel like Murray's like kind of like a weird tweener, right? Whereas I think like, you would probably like to have somebody who can kind of just play straight up wing defense on some guys.
Yeah.
Or at the very least somebody that can rebound, and kind of play some interior, D next to Sabonis. So that's where I'm like, are they getting a 4? Are they getting a 3? I don't know. But whatever position, it needs to be somebody I think that can, defend, but also space the floor.
100%.
But again, a lot of teams are looking for that. So that's kind of a, a generic response, I think.
Yeah.
Well, that's pretty much it for today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Obviously a very long one. But we did this last year. We got through it. So hopefully you got through it with us as well. Obviously, as we've already mentioned, we're going to do a live stream for the draft, right? The first round, I believe, is this Wednesday at 7, or, it's next Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern time. So, hopefully you pop in and join us in there, right? As we've already mentioned, we're going to have, some guests on there or a guest on there. We'll see. But again, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. If you leave a comment on, any of these socials or the video, we'll try to read it for the next episode. So hopefully, as I've already said, either we see you in the next episode or we see you in the next live stream.